Rick and Morty kills 26 characters per episode. By season 2, nobody counts. But inside that volume of disposable death is a handful of losses built so carefully they still ache. One happens 6 episodes in. The show never undoes it. A child buries his own corpse to Mazzy Star. This is every painful death in Rick and Morty. How this show kills 26. That is the average number of characters who die in a single episode of Rick and Morty, as counted across the show's early run by sources who apparently had the patience to tally every on-screen casualty across 31 episodes. The total came out to 808 deaths, which works out to just over 26 per installment. The math is impressive in a grim sort of way, and it tells you something important about the show before a single death has been examined closely. The volume is the first fact. The volume is also, in a very specific and carefully constructed sense, the point. Because what 26 deaths per episode actually does to a viewer over time is nothing. It produces numbness rather than weight. By the midpoint of the second season, an ordinary audience member has watched so many creatures disintegrated, diced, exploded, consumed, crushed, and simply erased that the individual event stops registering. A guard gets vaporized in the background of a prison break. A planet's entire population is reshaped into monsters and abandoned. A man is sliced into neat cubes by a car's defense system, while Summer watches from the back seat, and the scene plays as a throwaway joke about Rick's tendency to over-engineer things. The deaths pile up so quickly and so casually that the show essentially conditions its audience against grief, training them to read mass slaughter as the texture of the world rather than as a tragedy within it. That conditioning is deliberate, and it serves a function. Rick and Morty is a show built around a man who has decided, as a philosophical position rather than a coping mechanism, that death is not meaningful. Rick moves through the multiverse with an ease that makes mortality feel like a local inconvenience rather than a universal truth. He can portal out of a dying reality. He can clone a new body. He can hop his consciousness from one skull to another when his own gives out. He has, by the later seasons, effectively engineered his way around dying as a permanent condition, and the show's opening seasons mirror his perspective visually, staging death after death after death in a tone that matches his shrug. If Rick does not treat it as serious, the framing suggests, perhaps it is not. But the show has been running a second argument underneath that surface, and it takes a specific kind of patience to find it. The argument is that the conditioning is the setup, not the conclusion. The 26 deaths per episode are a deliberate numbing, a way of establishing the rules of the world at the highest possible volume, so that when the show finally decides to break those rules, the break lands with maximum force. Every comedic death the audience absorbed without feeling is preparation for the handful of deaths the show built to be genuinely unbearable, and the contrast between the two types is where the show's real argument about loss begins. The distinction between the two categories is not about the importance of the character who dies, or even about how long the audience has known them. It is about whether the show gives the loss permanence. A comedic death in Rick and Morty is reversible in some sense, or at least deniable. The world is full of duplicates. Every version of every person exists in infinite variations across the multiverse, which means that technically nothing is ever finally gone. This is the philosophical framework the show builds in its early seasons, and Rick deploys it constantly as a reason not to mourn, a reason not to attach, a reason to portal out of a burning reality and step into the nearest functional replacement without looking back. If every person exists in a billion copies, then the death of one of them is less an ending than a minor subtraction from a number so large it barely changes. For a long time, the show lets that framework stand unexamined. The early seasons are full of deaths that fit inside it comfortably. Aliens die in droves. Alternate versions of familiar characters are sacrificed as plot machinery. The Meeseeks perish by design, blinking out the moment their assigned task is done. And their deaths are played for comedy because they were manufactured for exactly that ending. Even the death of an alternate Rick, which might seem like it should carry weight, tends to register as a gag about how many Ricks there are. The multiverse absorbs everything. Nothing sticks. The framework holds. And then, 6 episodes into the first season, the show quietly breaks it. Not loudly, not with a dramatic announcement that things have changed, just with a boy who has to dig a hole in a backyard while a song by Mazzy Star plays over the scene, and then has to climb down into it and look at his own dead face, and then has to cover it back up with dirt and go inside and sit on the couch in a house that belongs to a family that is technically not his. The Cronenberg World episode, Rick Potion number 9, is where the real argument of this essay begins. And it begins there not because it is the most emotionally sophisticated complicated death the show ever staged, but because it is the moment the framework cracks. For the first time, a loss is handed to a character with no counterargument. The dead Rick and Morty of the replacement dimension cannot be replaced with yet another version. There are no more moves. The family left behind in the ruined world cannot be retrieved. The world itself cannot be fixed. The multiverse, which was supposed to make death feel lightweight, has produced a scenario in which its logic makes everything worse. That reversal is the template the most painful deaths in this show all follow. The ones that genuinely hurt are the ones where the multiverse framework stops providing comfort and starts providing horror. The revelation that the Omega device erased Diane Sanchez from every single reality, without exception, turns the thing that was supposed to guarantee redundancy into the instrument of an absolute and final erasure. A weapon designed to work across all of infinity, to remove a person not just from one timeline, but from the entire structure of existence, produces the only kind of death in this show that the multiverse cannot buffer. The worst losses in Rick and Morty are the ones engineered to defeat the logic that is supposed to make loss bearable. And the show keeps designing new ways to close the exit that Rick built for himself. The deaths that will occupy the rest of this essay are not the 26 per episode deaths. They are the other category, the ones the show built with care and intention, the losses that were given permanent architecture rather than comedic speed. Some of them involve major characters whose deaths the show had been building toward across multiple seasons. Some involve minor characters who were given just enough specificity that their ending lands harder than their screen time would predict. Some involve what might be more accurately called deaths of a self rather than deaths of a person. The episodes where a character is damaged or replaced in a way that leaves something real and irreplaceable gone, even if the body survives. All of them share the common property that the show refused to let the multiverse absorb them cleanly, refused to provide the philosophical exit Rick would usually reach for, and held the audience in the loss longer than comfort would allow. To understand why the show designed its most painful deaths the way it did, it helps to sit with the show's central tension around mortality for a moment. Rick is the most powerful argument the series can make for the idea that death does not matter. He is a man who has, by any reasonable measure, defeated it. He has backup clones, consciousness transfer technology, a portal gun that can take him to a reality where this version of the crisis has not yet happened. He treats dying as a logistics problem. The show underlines this throughout, staging his near deaths as puzzles he solves, rather than threats he narrowly escapes. And in doing so, it sets up its own counter-argument, because a man who has solved death is a man with nothing to fear, and a man with nothing to fear is a man who cannot be moved. And the show is quietly insistent that Rick's inability to be moved by loss is not strength, but damage. The 26 deaths per episode are Rick's worldview made visual. The handful of genuinely painful ones are the show's rebuttal. That rebuttal takes different shapes across the seasons, and this essay will follow them in order. There is the category of deaths that redefine the show's rules almost immediately, the ones from the early seasons that told the audience this was not an ordinary animated comedy. There is the category of deaths tied to specific relationships, the loss of a best friend at a wedding, the loss of a father that never happened and instead became the engine of everything, the deaths that reveal how Rick's emotional world is structured by cataloging what he cannot afford to lose. There is the category of deaths that are really about Morty, about what the show's other protagonist has had to absorb over the course of the series, and how each loss has changed him, made him harder and stranger, and less like the frightened boy who showed up in the pilot. There is the category of deaths in the Citadel, the deaths of the forgotten versions of Rick and Morty, the ones who fell through the cracks of a civilization built around their own name. And there is the category that takes the longest to fully land, the deaths that are not of bodies, but of selves, the losses of identity and peace and innocence that the show stages as horror without calling them deaths at all. What connects all of these categories, and what makes the topic worth the full length of this essay, is the thing the show is ultimately arguing with each of them. The argument is not that death is sad, which would be trivially true and not worth 8 seasons of careful construction. The argument is more specific than that. It is that the way Rick relates to death, the philosophy of replaceable realities and infinite redundancy and shrugging past the loss and reaching for the portal gun, is the core of the damage the show has been diagnosing in him since the pilot. Every painful death in Rick and Morty is, from a certain angle, evidence in a case the show is building against its own protagonist. A demonstration that the man who has defeated death has done so at the cost of something the show treats as more valuable than survival. He is alive. He is brilliant. He has outlasted every enemy enemy and engineered his way past every ending. And the people who have genuinely died around him, the ones whose deaths the show treats as permanent and real and worth grieving, represent the life he has not been living, the relationships he has been managing from a distance, the losses he has been routing around rather than sitting inside.
The show established that argument carefully over its first 2 seasons, before the audience fully understood it was an argument at all.
The deaths in the early run seem, on first viewing, to be individual events. A relationship lost here, a world abandoned there, a best friend shot at a wedding over there. It is only when they are laid alongside each other that the shape of the thing becomes clear, a steady accumulation of losses that Rick responds to by building a larger, more sophisticated avoidance, a better portal gun, a wider citadel, a more thorough hunting of the one specific grief he will allow himself to chase rather than feel. The painful deaths are not a parade of tragedies for their own sake. They are a record. The show has been honest, in scattered moments across every season, about what kind of record it is. In the second season episode that reunites Rick with Unity, the hive mind he once loved, there is a line delivered quietly by the departing entity that functions as the thesis of this entire subject. Unity tells him, in her goodbye, that he brings out a version of her that she cannot survive, and then she leaves a man who, by every external measure, has everything under control. The following scene, staged in the garage with a song and a device and a long silence, is the show's clearest single image of what all those deaths have added up to. The cost of being the being who treats every loss as a variable to be optimized around rather than a wound to be carried. He is, in that moment, neither winning nor losing. He is simply, for the first time in the episode, alone with the consequences of how he has been dying all along. Not in the dramatic way that gets tallied in the 26 per episode count, but in the slow way. The way that does not show up in the statistics because it does not produce a corpse. That slow way is the subject of this essay. The Cronenberg world and the wedding on planet Squanch, and the Omega device, and the factory workers and the Citadel, and the thing Morty had to become in order to keep surviving at Rick's side, all of it is death by the show's own accounting, and all of it is part of the same argument. The show invented a universe where dying is fast and cheap and happens 26 times per episode, and where the smartest being alive has effectively removed himself from its jurisdiction. And then it spent 8 seasons building the case that none of that machinery changes the fundamental fact about loss, that the things which genuinely hurt are the ones you cannot portal away from, and that a man who has spent his life engineering those exits has not defeated grief. He has simply accumulated it, stored it in every room of a life he keeps very busy so he will not have to open the doors. Those doors are what the following sections open, one at a time, starting with the one he never goes near if he can help it, the room where the whole story actually began. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This established the show's relationship with death as a design choice, the distinction between comedic deaths and the handful of losses the show built to genuinely land, and the argument the series has been constructing underneath the volume. Next, the focus turns to the loss that predates the show itself, the death that organized Rick's entire life before the first episode began. Section 2. Diane Sanchez. Before Rick Prime dropped the bomb, before the portal gun existed, before any version of this story had begun, there was an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary house in a dimension the show would eventually designate as C-137. And in that house, a man and his wife and their small daughter were just living. The show never shows this afternoon directly. By the time the audience is allowed any glimpse of what Diane Sanchez looked like, what she sounded like, what she was actually like as a person, several seasons have already passed. And the glimpse arrives not through a real memory, but through a fear hole in a Denny's bathroom on an alien planet. That delay was not an accident. The show spent years building the absence before it built the person. Because an absence that is felt long enough becomes the kind of grief that lands without needing explanation. And Diane Sanchez is, above everything else, an absence. She is also the reason this essay exists. Every death that will be examined across the remaining sections traces back, directly or indirectly, to the afternoon Rick Prime arrived at that house. Not because every painful thing in the show is literally Diane's fault, but because the person Rick became after losing her is the person responsible for everything that followed. The Cronenberg world, Bird Person's wedding, the Citadel, the decades-long hunt, the near death in the garage after Unity leaves, the frozen dimension, the hologram, the wall around infinity that was dressed up as an empire. All of it grows out of the same root, a loss that was never processed and therefore never finished, a wound
wound the show kept finding new ways to open because its subject kept finding new ways to seal it over without healing it. The origin took years to fully reveal, and the show was careful about how it rationed the information. For the first 2 seasons, Diane was barely a presence at all. Rick's wife and Beth's mother existed as a gap in the family history, never named, never pictured, gestured at occasionally through the shape of her absence. When the 3rd season premiere placed Rick inside a memory scanner operated by the Galactic Federation, the audience expected a revelation about his backstory, and the show gave them one, but it was a fabricated one. A gleefully false origin built around a craving for discontinued fast food sauce, performed in the voice of a man who knows exactly which buttons to press to make an interrogator feel clever while hiding the real information underneath the performance. The scene was funny, and it was a misdirection, and it worked because the real origin was still being kept. The show understood that the true story of Diane would only land once the audience trusted that the show was capable of genuine seriousness, and it waited until it had earned that trust. The full picture arrived in pieces across the 5th and 6th seasons. Rick Mirai Jack, the 5th season finale, began to assemble the real history, the shape of a man who had once fought alongside Bird Person in a resistance against the Galactic Federation, who had not always been the bitter, self-isolating figure the audience knew, who had in fact been someone earlier and different before one afternoon took that person away and replaced him with the version doing the shrugging and the portal jumping. The bombing of his house, the deaths of Diane and young Beth C-137, the decision Rick Prime made with cold deliberation after Rick refused his offer of interdimensional travel. These details settled into place with the accumulated weight of several seasons of careful preparation. By the time they arrived, the audience did not need them explained. The emotional logic had already been building across years of watching the man those events produced. What makes Diane's death singular among the losses in this show is not the violence of it, though the violence was real, a bomb delivered by a version of Rick's own face, a man who shared his genetic code and chose to weaponize the familiarity. The singularity is in what came after, in the specific shape of the damage and the specific ways Rick chose to live inside it rather than through it. After the loss, he built an artificial recreation of his dead wife and installed it in his home dimension, the original dimension, Dimension C-137, the one whose Rick had been killed and whose Beth and Diane were gone. The 6th season premiere, Solarix, revealed that he kept that dimension running on a kind of frozen loop centered on the worst day of his life, its inhabitants trapped in a time structure built around his grief while he went traveling the multiverse. In the wreckage of that house, he placed a holographic voice, built from memory, shaped to sound like her calling to him from another room. He described it, in the episode itself, as a way of reminding himself of his failure and of his obligation to continue hunting. But a man who builds a thing that sounds like his dead wife and returns to it alone across decades is not only building a reminder, he is building the closest thing to her presence that his genius can produce. And the gap between that construct and the real person is the measure of what cannot be engineered back into existence. The space cruiser's AI voice operates the same way. For seasons, the ship's computer spoke in a tone that the audience registered as simply the ship, background presence, navigation and commentary, and the occasional warning. The later revelation that Rick built that voice on Diane's reframes every prior episode retroactively. Every time Rick drove in silence with the ship speaking directions, he was sitting inside a machine that sounded like the person he lost. He built her into his daily life in the one form he could manage, present enough to be heard and safely fictional enough never to be lost again. The ship cannot die. The AI cannot leave. The voice is permanent in a way the person could not be, and the arrangement is the most precise single image of how Rick's engineering instinct and his grief have become the same thing. A man who learned to want only what he could build and control, rather than risk wanting what could be taken. Rick Prime understood the dynamic clearly enough to weaponize it in their confrontation in Unmortican. He built a killbot that wore Diane's face, gave it her voice, deployed it as a trap for the Ricks who came hunting him in revenge for their own Dianes. A man mourning his wife could be led toward a machine wearing her image, and Rick Prime counted on that, counted on the grief being powerful enough to override the intelligence that should have seen the trap coming. He was not entirely wrong, which is the part the show does not let the audience miss. The sight of something shaped like her, sounding like her, reaching toward Rick across the chamber where Rick Prime was running his ambush, is genuinely horrifying precisely because the show has spent so long establishing that this is the one variable no amount of genius has ever been able to neutralize. The Omega device is where the death stops being a tragedy of one dimension and becomes something closer to a philosophical atrocity. Rick Prime revealed during the confrontation in Unmortican that after killing Diane Diane C-137, he repeated the process across every dimension, targeting the Dianes of every Rick who had refused the same offer. And that eventually, when the multiverse proved too full of surviving versions, he deployed the Omega device to remove her from every reality simultaneously. The weapon did not kill a person, it killed an entire category of person, the set of all possible Dianes, the complete population of a specific human being across every instance of reality. The multiverse, which the show had spent seasons using as a philosophical argument for why no single loss should devastate anyone, was used to make a loss that the multiverse itself could not buffer. There is no backup Diane. There is no replacement reality where she is still alive. The Omega device closed every exit the multiverse philosophy had offered, and Rick has known this since before Unmortrican made it explicit, which means every moment he spent traveling infinite realities was a moment spent in a universe from which she had already been deliberately and permanently removed. Rick Prime demonstrated the Omega device's function during that confrontation by using it first on Slow Mobius, a figure from Rick's past, an uncle of sorts, a being the show had not spent time establishing, but who clearly carried weight to the man watching. The erasure of Slow Mobius from every reality at once, performed casually, performed to illustrate a point, performed while Rick Prime watched Rick's face for the reaction, is one of the show's coldest single moments. And it works partly because the show had already spent seasons building the context in which such an erasure carries genuine horror. Rick Prime admitted, in the same breath, that it hurt him too, that he had some attachment to the figure he had just unmade from all of existence. He said so, and then did it anyway. And that combination, the acknowledgement of the loss and the deliberate choice to inflict it regardless, is the show's portrait of what the cruelest possible version of Rick's intelligence looks like when it is pointed entirely outward with no remaining care for its own damage. The nearest the show ever came to letting Rick grieve Diane in something approaching real time arrived in the 7th season finale, in an episode that staged the encounter through the mechanism of a fear hole discovered in a Denny's bathroom. Morty jumped in, and Rick followed. And inside the hole, the two of them found a version of Diane, built from Morty's knowledge of her, rather than from Rick's actual memories, which meant she was composed of everything Morty had absorbed about her from Rick's life, shaped into a presence plausible enough that Rick could not immediately dismiss it. The episode is careful about what it tells the audience through this encounter. The fearhole Diane was horrified by the person Rick had become, the wreckage visible in his face and manner, and said so in a line that the show treated as a direct hit. Rick replied that he had become this because he lost her, and the exchange contained more direct engagement with his grief than the previous 7 seasons combined. They spent time together inside the hole, drinking, talking, falling back into something that resembled the ease they must have had before the afternoon everything ended. Rick did not want to leave. The episode made this plain. What the show did with that reluctance is the most important moment in the entire history of this specific loss. When Morty finally escaped the fear hole for real and emerged to find Rick standing outside it, having never entered, Rick considered jumping in. He stood at the edge of a hole that could give him a version of her, fabricated and temporary and not real and completely insufficient, and he chose not to. He left instead. He placed a photograph of Morty on the board at the entrance, the board where the hole kept pictures of everyone who had conquered it, and he walked away. The choice is not triumphant. The show does not frame it as the moment Rick finally healed or finally moved forward in any resolved sense. It is smaller than that and more honest. A man who recognized that the version of his wife the hole would provide was a trap of the same kind he had already been living in. Another machine that sounded like her without being her. Another beautifully constructed substitute for the grief he still had not sat down inside. Jumping in would have been one more way of avoiding the actual loss, by building a tolerable replica of her presence. And the show gave him the awareness to see that and the will to walk away from it, and declined to make either of those things feel like a cure. So Diane Sanchez is not a character the show depicts in any traditional sense. She is an origin, an engine, a permanent absence around which the most significant man in the multiverse organized the better part of his existence. Her death predates the story and remains, in the show's own accounting, the true beginning of it, the event from which everything else in the series ultimately descends. She was erased from every reality by a weapon her husband's counterpart invented for exactly that purpose, leaving a shape in the world that no device and no portal and no engineered facsimile has ever been able to fill. The show spent 8 seasons demonstrating, through every tool available to it, that the smartest mind ever depicted cannot think its way out of missing a person, and the proof is the machine he built to sound like her, running in a frozen dimension, still calling to him from the other room, in a house he has not let move forward from the afternoon she died. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
tremendously. The loss that started everything stayed unresolved across the show's entire run, an absence no machine could fill and no revenge could close. The next death the essay turns to is one the audience watched happen in real time, 6 episodes into the first season, a quieter catastrophe that required no bomb and no weapon, only a boy with a shovel and the most ordinary object in the world, his own face staring up at him from a hole in the backyard. Section 3. The Boy in the Backyard. Sometime around the 5th episode, a first-time viewer could have reasonably concluded they understood what kind of show this was. A brilliant, damaged grandfather drags his frightened teenage grandson across the multiverse. Chaos results, Rick fixes it or escapes it, and by the next week the garage looks more or less the same as it did before. The show had established a rhythm that felt, if not exactly safe, at least self-correcting. Things went wrong, the wrong was managed, the credits rolled. It was a perfectly functional format for an absurdist animated comedy, and the 6th episode of the first season began in a way that seemed to confirm the format completely. A boy had a crush. The boy asked his genius grandfather for help. The grandfather brewed something simple and handed it over, already bored by the request. The machinery of a contained, self-correcting adventure was fully in place. What happened next is the most important single episode in the history of the show's relationship with its audience, and it is important precisely because of how ordinary the premise was before it broke. The love serum worked. That was the first problem, and it became the disaster. Jessica had a cold, and the serum bonded with the virus, and within minutes it was airborne across the school, and then the town, and then the planet, and every human being on Earth who was not directly related to Morty fell desperately, unmanageably in love with him. Rick began remedying the situation the way he always does, with chemistry. The first antidote turned the infected population into praying mantis hybrids. The second, formulated from a list of ingredients that included rattlesnake, chimpanzee, and what Rick described as just a small amount of dinosaur, turned the praying mantis hybrids into something worse. The show named the resulting creatures Cronenbergs, after the director of a specific genre of body horror, and the name was precise, because the things that shambled through the streets of the ruined world were not monsters in any clean or comic sense. They were people who had been through something done to them by chemistry in the hands of a man who was certain he understood what he was doing. Rick looked at the world he had produced and assessed it with the same instrument he uses for every problem, which is his intelligence. And his intelligence told him clearly that this particular problem was beyond fixing. Not beyond his fixing in particular, beyond fixing at any scale or by any method. He had created something irreversible, and for once, there was no third serum, no fourth approach, no angle that the same brilliance that caused the catastrophe could take to undo it. The self-correcting format snapped. The show let the audience feel the snap, held the moment of it, and then Rick did the thing that would define him as a character across every subsequent season. He did not attempt to fix it. He looked for a reality where the fixing had already been done, scanned the multiverse for a dimension where alternate versions of the pair had solved the problem, and then died shortly afterward in an unrelated accident in the garage. And when he found one, he took Morty by the arm and walked through. The logic is airtight and deeply awful. A dimension where the problem was solved already exists. A dimension where 2 specific people died already exists. Entering the solved dimension, finding the bodies of the people who died in the garage accident, and quietly assuming their lives requires nothing more than a portal jump and a shovel. To Rick, this is a math problem with a solution. He states the solution as though it is unremarkable, because to his mind, at the scale of the multiverse, it is. 2 more people are now dead in a world full of dead things. 2 new people are alive in a world that already had working versions of them. The numbers wash out. The show stays on Morty's face for the burial scene, and the decision to do so is the episode's real argument. The rebuttal to the mathematical logic Rick just stated. Morty has to pick up a shovel. Morty has to dig the hole. Morty has to look down at the body of a boy his own age, wearing his own face, dead from an explosion that happened in a garage while trying to fix the problem that this Morty caused, and he has to lower that body into the ground and cover it up. The show does not rush this. It plays the song that became the scene's permanent companion, Mazzy Star's Look On Down from the Bridge, a piece of music chosen with precision because it does not sound like a cartoon, does not sound like a joke landing, does not sound like anything that belongs in an absurdist animated comedy. It sounds like grief that has not yet found its shape, which is exactly what the boy digging the hole has not yet found. Morty finishes the burial, goes inside, sits on the couch in a living room belonging to a family that is technically not his, and does not move. The 1,000-yard stare the show gave him in that final image was something animators put on soldiers returning from places they could not explain to people who had not been there. The family left behind in the ruined dimension is a detail the show could have quietly forgotten. Many series would
have, treating the abandoned world as a necessary plot mechanism and moving on. Rick and Morty instead made a brief, deliberate choice in the episode's closing moments to show the audience the Cronenberg world without its Rick and Morty. Beth and Jerry and Summer of the original Dimension, the actual biological family of the Rick and Morty the audience had been following for 6 episodes, survived the catastrophe. They lived through it, and by the episode's end, they were shown roasting a dead Cronenberg over a fire in the ruins of the world their grandfather and brother helped destroy, which the show presented not as horror, but as a strange, functional adaptation. Beth and Jerry, freed from the particular gravity of Rick's presence, appeared to be managing. They appeared, in the specific way that people manage when there is nothing else available, to be okay. That detail is not a comfort. It is an accusation in the shape of a comfort, because the 2 people digging a grave in the replacement dimension's backyard are the reason the original family is living in rubble. The transfer was clean on Rick's side of the equation and catastrophic on every other side, and the show never pretended otherwise. It let the arithmetic of the thing stand in full view without asking the audience to accept it as acceptable. The world that Rick could not fix was not cleaned up off-screen. It was shown, briefly, to be surviving in the absence of the people who broke it and fled, and the juxtaposition between the couch in the new dimension and the fire in the old one is where the episode's moral weight finally settles. 2 episodes later, in Rick's Minutes, the show returned to the burial in a way that clarified what it had been building toward. Summer discovered that she was an unplanned pregnancy, that her existence had been the product of a near accident rather than a choice, and she began to process the information badly, talking about leaving. Morty's response to this was to take her to the backyard and show her the graves. He told her plainly that he had come from a dimension where he watched himself die and buried his own corpse, that no one exists on purpose, that no one belongs anywhere, and that everyone is eventually going to die. He told her this not as a nihilistic attack, but as a genuine attempt at comfort. The logic being that a universe where nothing is special and no existence is guaranteed is also a universe where her accidental origin carries no particular shame. The speech is Rictopian philosophy at its most clearly stated. The worldview Rick carries and never articulates, delivered by his grandson to an audience of 1 in a backyard containing a fresh grave. Morty could only give that speech because of what he had already been made to do. The burial was the tuition for the wisdom. The Cronenberg world resurfaced again in the 6th season premiere Solarix, when a portal fluid reset sent travelers back to their realities of origin. The episode checked in on the original dimension briefly, the world left behind in season 1, and the check-in was not reassuring. The world had not healed. The consequences had continued past the point where the show stopped watching them, which was the show's way of confirming that the abandonment was not a moment but a permanent state, an ongoing fact about the universe the audiences Rick and Morty had left behind and continued to leave behind simply by existing in the replacement dimension rather than the original one. Every adventure since the burial has taken place in a borrowed world. The lives being lived since that night are borrowed lives. The home is someone else's home, occupied by the survivors of someone else's accident, and the original family is still out there somewhere in the rubble, building what they can from what remains. What the Cronenberg world established, and what distinguishes it from every other catastrophe the show would stage in subsequent seasons, is the principle of the unretracted consequence. Rick and Morty arrived in its first 5 episodes with a clear, implicit promise, the promise of the self-correcting format, and the 6th episode broke that promise at the root, and then refused to apologize for or undo the breaking. The world stayed broken. The dead Rick and Morty stayed in the ground. The abandoned family stayed in their firelit rubble. The show moved forward, carrying everything it had just done, and it has been carrying it ever since, through every season and every adventure and every episode that the replacement Morty has lived through, in a life that technically began with a shovel and a song in someone else's backyard. The specific loss at the center of this episode is harder to name than the deaths that surrounded it, because what died was not a character the audience had followed and loved. What died was a version of the main characters, which means what died was the show's ability to pretend that its adventures are without weight. Before the burial, an episode could end, and the garage could look the same, and the next adventure could begin. After it, that pretense was no longer available. The show was now a story about people living inside consequences they could not escape by portaling into a different set of consequences. And the boy on the couch with the 1,000-yard stare was the proof. Morty Smith of Dimension C-137 died in a garage accident trying to fix a problem he helped cause. The Morty sitting on that couch knows this, has buried the evidence, will will live inside the knowledge for the rest of his life, in a family that lost their Rick and Morty, and had another pair simply step into the empty space without asking permission. And the show has never once allowed either of its leads to fully outrun what that means. The song choice was the final confirmation that the show knew exactly what it was doing. Look On, Down from the Bridge does not belong in a comedy. It belongs in a burial. Whoever selected it understood that the scene it was being asked to accompany was not a comedic reversal or a dark joke or a satirical comment on genre conventions. It was a funeral for the format itself, staged in a backyard, attended by a boy who had to do the digging. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The burial in the backyard was the show's proof that its consequences were real and unretractable, a lesson Morty carried forward in his body from that night onward. The next loss the essay turns to is older, built across 2 full seasons of quiet establishment before it was taken. A best friendship that ended at a wedding on the night Rick finally let himself give a toast. Section 4. A funeral with cake. Rick said it himself on the morning the invitation arrived. He held the thing up, turned it over, put it down, and told the family that weddings were funerals with cake. Nobody took the line seriously because it sounded like the kind of reflexive cynicism he deployed on everything. The same contempt he brought to birthdays and television programs, and most human institutions he considered evidence of sentimentality. The observation was filed as a joke. It was not a joke. Bird Person had been a presence in Rick's life long before the show introduced him to the audience, and the show was careful to make the history feel earned before it made it feel like a loss. The friendship carried weight that predated the series by decades. 2 figures who had fought together in the same galactic resistance against the Federation that would later cage Rick, who had, in the language Bird Person himself used to describe it at the wedding, committed numerous atrocities together in the name of something they believed in. The word atrocities was not softened or corrected. The show let it sit as the accurate description of what a war asks of the people willing to fight one, and let the friendship that survived those acts stand as evidence of how deeply those 2 specific people had been shaped by the same fire. The audience met Bird Person properly in the first season. At a party Rick threw at the house in an episode largely remembered for other reasons, and the introduction was deliberate in its smallness. Bird Person was not announced as a figure of cosmic significance. He was simply present, quietly observant, speaking slowly and with a literalness that the show used as a soft-running comedy, while clearly establishing that the comedy was affectionate rather than mocking. He was the one person in the room who seemed to know Rick without needing anything from him, who read the bravado and the performance and the drinking accurately, and did not respond to any of it with alarm or disappointment. That quality, the capacity to be around Rick without being managed by him, was vanishingly rare in the show's population. Bird Person had it because he had known the person before the performance hardened, had been present for the man Rick was before the loss that the series was still years away from fully revealing. His appearances across the second season deepened the portrait without rushing it. By the time the wedding invitation arrived, the audience had been given enough of the friendship to understand what it meant for Rick to attend at all. He did not attend things. He declined invitations, deflected obligations, found reasons to be elsewhere when the occasion required him to be present for someone other than himself. The family had to resort to Jerry accidentally triggering the courier into shipping himself to the wedding planet before Rick would agree to go. And even then, he arrived at the open bar rather than the celebration, positioned at the maximum comfortable distance from the emotional center of the event, which was exactly where the audience expected to find him. What the show did next is what made the episode unforgettable before anything terrible had happened. Morty told Rick to open up, to try, to participate in his best friend's happiness, rather than stand at the margin of it, cataloging reasons to be contemptuous of weddings. And Rick, for reasons the episode does not fully explain and does not need to, listened. He gave a toast. He stood at the reception and spoke about love and friendship and his genuine happiness for the couple being joined. And the speech was imperfect in the way his attempts at sincerity always are, laced with the kind of bleak asides that follow him everywhere. But underneath the asides was something real, visible, and unmanaged. A man actually present at a moment that mattered to him rather than performing indifference at its edge. The toast was the show's demonstration that this capacity existed in him, that the part of Rick capable of standing in a room and meaning it was not entirely gone. It mattered that the show established this first. The capacity for genuine presence had to be on the table before the show could take the thing that called it out. Tammy stood up to respond. Summer's friend from school, Bird Person's young bride, the woman who had been woven into the background of several episodes as a familiar presence in the family's orbit, she did not offer a toast. She announced herself as a deep cover agent of the Galactic Federation, confirmed that the entire marriage had been a manufactured structured intelligence operation designed to gather Bird Person's network of criminal associates in a single location and drew her weapon in the same motion. Bird Person was shot multiple times before he could fully process what his wife had just said at their wedding reception. He had moments earlier been married, had heard Rick, of all people, speak something approaching tenderness in front of a room full of people, had presumably arrived at the threshold of whatever life comes after a long war when the fighting stops. The shots that followed arrived with the speed of something that was never going to be argued with or outrun, and Rick's cry across the reception room, his best friend's name used as a sound rather than a word, carries the specific texture of a person watching something happen that they had no strategy for because they did not know it was a possibility. This death is distinguished from nearly every other death in the show by the quality of Rick's response, which was visible and unmediated in a way that the show almost never allowed. He did not immediately pivot to problem solving. He did not produce a gadget or a plan or a portal. He reacted for a measurable stretch of screen time as a person rather than as the smartest man in the universe. And the reaction was grief, open and unmanaged and impossible to read as anything else. The show gave him that moment without softening it and without rushing past it into the next tactical problem. Because the tactical problem that came next, the escape, the pursuit, the eventual Federation surrender, was built on top of that grief rather than instead of it. The surrender that followed is the episode's second great revelation about Rick's emotional architecture. He overheard Jerry suggesting the family turn him in, and he overheard the rest of the family refusing, and he heard them defend him with a loyalty he had not earned and did not deserve by his own measure. And then he did the thing the audience had been told across 2 seasons was not in him. He called the Federation himself. He traded his freedom for their safety, arranged the exchange quietly, and left without ceremony, telling Morty he was going for ice cream so that the boy would not be able to stop him. The surrender was a direct consequence of losing Bird Person. The two events are connected not just chronologically, but causally, because the wedding stripped away every layer Rick had built between himself and the fact of caring, and what was left underneath those layers, bare and suddenly visible, was a man who could not stand the idea of losing anyone else that night. The Federation scientists brought Bird Person back in the manner the show announced in the post-credits scene of the 3rd season premiere. They rebuilt what remained of him with cybernetic parts, restructured his body into something functional and weaponized, and activated the result under a new designation. Phoenix Person retained Bird Person's physical form in a heavily modified state, and operated under Tammy's authority as an instrument of the organization that had destroyed him and killed his colleagues at the wedding. The name Tammy gave the reconstruction did not appear to be her idea, and the show gave no indication she approved of it. Bird Person chose the name for himself, to whatever extent a being rebuilt by the Federation and deployed against its enemies was in any position to choose anything. The name was the one remaining sign that something of the original was present inside the machinery, a person insisting on being called something other than what the people who rebuilt him decided he was. Rick eventually fought Phoenix Person, and the fight was not the victory the show's action logic might have promised. Fighting the cybernetic reconstruction of a best friend, a body wearing the physical form of someone whose death had not yet been fully processed, required a kind of compartmentalization that the show did not pretend was healthy or clean. Rick won in the operational sense of the word, but winning in this context meant subduing the thing that used to be his person, and the show treated the victory with the weight that required, rather than with the uncomplicated triumph of a problem solved. The 6th season returned to Bird Person in a way that demonstrated more clearly than any action sequence what Rick's friendship with him actually meant. Having eventually freed him from the Federation's control, Rick spent substantial time across that season venturing into the damaged interior of Bird Person's mind, navigating the wreckage of his memories and his sense of self in an attempt to find and restore what had survived. The process required a form of care and patience and sustained emotional labor that Rick almost never applied to anything. And the show was deliberate about showing it, because the contrast with his usual approach to intimacy was the point. Rick would build a machine for almost any purpose rather than sit with another person's pain. Inside Bird Person's mind, he had no machine to hide behind, only the willingness to go in and stay long enough to do the work, and the willingness was real. What Bird Person represented in Rick's life, and what his death cost beyond the immediate grief, was the last living connection to the version of Rick that existed before the loss of Diane. Bird Person had known both men, the soldier who fought a war for something he believed in, and the bitter, self-isolating isolating figure who built a wall around infinity, and the friendship carried the memory of the earlier person in a way that nothing else in Rick's life could.
When Bird Person was shot at the wedding, the show was not only staging the death of a beloved character, it was staging the destruction of a relationship that functioned as the last surviving evidence that Rick had once been capable of living toward something rather than away from everything. The wedding was meant to be the beginning of Bird Person's next life. It ended the last witness to Rick's previous one. The episode's title, which framed the wedding through the lens of the planet where it was held, rather than the event itself, was its own small misdirection. The Squanchers of Planet Squanch were peripheral to what the episode actually staged, which was the most expensive thing Rick had paid for a relationship in the entire run of the series to that point. He arrived at the wedding reluctantly. He gave a toast he did not plan. He watched his oldest friend die before the cake was cut. He surrendered himself to a galactic empire rather than let the night take anyone else.
And then he sat in a prison and waited, carrying the specific knowledge that a man who once told him his history was soaked in the blood of friends and enemies was now part of the count. The toast was the thing that made the death land as hard as it did. If Rick had stayed at the bar and skipped the speech and kept the distance he preferred, Bird Person's death would have been a tragedy happening to a character the audience understood at arm's length. But the show made Rick open the door first. It let the audience see the capacity for presence and warmth that lived beneath the performance, and then it took the person who called that capacity out of him. The order mattered. The weapon was not the bullet. The weapon was the toast, the moment of genuine showing up, and everything that the shooting then destroyed was built on the foundation of that single, unguarded moment at a microphone, at a reception, on a planet in a dimension the Smiths would never be able to go back to.
Rick said weddings were funerals with cake, and everyone laughed at the timing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bird Person's death cost Rick the last witness to who he had been before everything broke, a loss no cybernetic rebuild could restore. The essay turns next to a death that belonged to Morty rather than Rick, a being Morty saved against all practical sense, killed by Morty's own hand before the credits rolled, on the worst possible terms. Section 5. What Morty learned to carry Crumbopulous. Michael loved his work. The show established this immediately, with a cheerfulness that made the character impossible to dislike, even while he was explaining that he would kill anyone, anything, for any reason, with no ethical reservations of any kind. He had a family. He was religious. He was professional in the way that people are professional when they genuinely enjoy their vocation, and his vocation was killing. Rick sold him an antimatter gun in a parking garage for 3,000 flurbos, and Crumbopulous Michael accepted it with the gratitude of someone who had found the right tool for a job he was already looking forward to. The scene was comedy, and the comedy was real, and the character was gone 11 minutes later when Morty stole the spaceship to stop the assassination and instead drove it directly through the wall of the building where Crumbopulous Michael was doing his job. The accident did not look like an accident. The screen held on the wreckage long enough for the weight of it to register, and then Rick arrived through a portal, surveyed what his grandson had done, and told him with calm precision that he had just killed his best customer. Morty Night Run is the episode that established what Morty's relationship with death actually costs him. And it established it through a structure that the audience did not fully understand until the antimatter gun fired at the end. The episode presented two deaths in the space of 22 minutes, separated by an adventure that appeared to be about saving a life. The first death, Crumbopulous Michael, was accidental, the result of a choice Morty made from a moral position that the show did not mock or dismiss. He did not want to allow an assassination he had the means to prevent. The impulse was genuine and decent, and it killed the assassin instantly while doing nothing for the target, who was still in the building, still waiting to be found. The second death, Fart, was deliberate, the result of a choice Morty made from the same moral position applied to different information, and it killed the being Morty had spent the entire episode trying to keep alive. The episode was constructed so that the two deaths mirrored each other exactly, because the show was making a specific argument about what a conscience costs when it is operating honestly in a universe that does not arrange itself around honest consciences. Fart arrived in the story as a presence rather than a character, a cloud of luminous gas with the ability to alter the composition of atoms and communicate through telepathy, held captive and scheduled for elimination by the now deceased Crumbopulous Michael. Morty pulled the being out of the facility and onto the ship, and in doing so, set off a chain of events, a chase, a betrayal by a gear-headed informant, a running firefight through several layers of Galactic Federation law enforcement that produced collateral damage accumulating at a rate Morty could track but not stop. Rick killed guards, Federation ships were destroyed, an entire detention corridor was flooded. Each death death and each act of destruction was a direct consequence of Morty's decision to save the gaseous being now riding in the back of the spaceship. And the show kept a running account of the accumulation, not loudly, but steadily, through Rick's increasingly pointed commentary and through Morty's increasingly tight expression as the bill climbed. Fart himself was not a villain in any conventional sense. The show was careful about this, careful enough to give him one of its most musically ambitious sequences, a psychedelic journey scored to something between David Bowie and a lullaby, the song Goodbye Moon Men, drifting through Morty's head via telepathy in a moment of genuine beauty that the episode staged with more visual ambition than almost anything else in the early seasons. The song was the show asking the audience to feel the friendship before it asked the audience to feel the complication. Fart was gentle and articulate and curious, and appeared to be, within the limits of the episode's runtime, the kind of being that warranted the effort Morty was putting into keeping it alive. Jermaine Clement's performance gave the character a serene quality that made it easy to understand why Morty had decided the assassination was worth stopping. The being seemed worth saving. The audience was meant to believe this alongside Morty, because the audience was going to have to sit with Morty at the end when the information changed. The information changed at the wormhole. Fart reached the opening back to its home dimension and told Morty, without apparent malice, that its species considered carbon-based life a pathogen and intended to return and remove it from the universe. All carbon-based life. The entirety of biological existence as experienced by every living thing Morty had ever known or loved, framed as a disease to be treated by a species powerful enough to alter the composition of atoms at will. Fart delivered the information as a statement of natural law rather than as a threat, with the same gentle clarity it had used to discuss everything else, and the show let the gentleness stand, rather than converting Fart into a snarling monster for the audience's convenience. The being was not lying. It was not being cruel. It held the view it described as straightforwardly as it held every other view, which was the detail that made the situation genuinely terrible, rather than simply action movie terrible. A villain with fangs could be dismissed. A being of absolute serenity announcing the planned extermination of all biological life was something harder to file away cleanly. Morty asked Fart to sing for him again. The song had been used earlier as a moment of wonder, a piece of beauty transmitted mind to mind between two beings that had no business being friends. Using it again, here, at this moment, was Morty asking for a final version of the thing he had valued most in the friendship, the quality of genuine strangeness made temporarily kind. Fart sang, and Morty raised the antimatter gun, the same gun Rick had sold to Crombopulus Michael, the same gun that the assassination of Fart had been commissioned with, and fired it into the being he had spent the entire episode protecting. The gun completed the shape the episode had been building. Crombopulus Michael had been paid to kill Fart with an antimatter gun, and was himself killed before he could. Morty had stopped the assassination on moral grounds, spent the entire episode absorbing the cost of that intervention, and then completed the assassination himself on the same moral grounds that had led him to prevent it. The antimatter gun passed through the episode from hired killer to idealistic teenager and arrived at the same destination by two different routes. And the difference between the routes was the difference between a man who killed without thinking about it and a boy who thought about nothing else and still arrived at the trigger. The show did not congratulate Morty for making the harder choice. The episode ended with him staring out the window of the returning ship, having killed the being he saved, having lost everyone who died between the saving and the killing, having achieved nothing except the prevention of something worse. Rick's summary of the whole expedition, delivered to fill the silence Morty was occupying, was the most honest accounting the character ever gave of what his adventures actually produce. That the only way to win at a certain kind of problem is to have never intervened in the first place, and that the only person in the episode who was ever going to come out ahead was the one who did not care about the outcome to begin with. He was describing Crombopulus Michael, and he was describing himself, and the comparison was not accidental. Roy Parsons was not a real person. This was established before Roy's life began, when Rick strapped the headset onto Morty at the Blips and Chits arcade and explained that the game simulated a complete human life, that the player lived it from childhood to death as a character named Roy, and that the measure of the game was how well Roy did. The game was played in the same episode as the fart sequence, positioned as Rick's reward for a morning's arms dealing, a piece of recreational escapism that arrived in the episode before the moral weight of the main plot had fully assembled itself. Morty went into Roy's life without preparation, and came out at the end having lived it in its entirety. Roy had a childhood defined by a recurring nightmare of old men and aliens, which the audience understood as Morty's consciousness bleeding through into the character it was inhabiting. He grew up wanting wanting to play football and shelved that dream to provide for a family. He spent decades at a carpet store. He was diagnosed with cancer in middle age, told his wife in a moment the show played with total sincerity that he was not ready to die, and then beat the cancer, which is the kind of victory that deserves celebration. The hard thing overcome, the body's most dangerous failure reversed through treatment and endurance and the specific will to stay. Roy beat cancer and returned to the carpet store. He was crushed by a loose roll of carpet falling from a display and died on the floor of his workplace. The show played this with no irony. The death of a simulated person, a fictional life inside a video game, received exactly the weight that a real death receives in the episode's framing, which was the point. Rick was impressed that Morty had gotten off the carpet, meaning that Morty's Roy had made the choice in late middle age to abandon the carpet store for something else, a choice most Roys apparently did not make. The measure of a life well lived, in Rick's unsentimental accounting, was whether the person playing it managed to stop doing the thing that was killing them slowly before the thing fell on them and killed them quickly instead. Roy had done this briefly, and then returned to the store, and then died there. And Rick's quiet acknowledgement of the achievement was the episode's most intimate moment, and also its most devastating, because the achievement being acknowledged was small, and the life being measured was made entirely of accumulated small things, and the fall of a carpet roll was exactly as random and unglamorous as real death tends to be. Together, the two deaths in Morty Night Run form the episode's thesis about what it costs Morty to have a conscience in this particular universe. Fart's death was chosen and terrible and necessary, and produced no feeling of having done the right thing, only the flat exhaustion of having done the only available thing. Roy's death was accidental and inevitable and represented the natural endpoint of a simulated life that contained genuine moments of beauty and failure and recovery, all of it rendered meaningless by a piece of merchandise that was not secured to the shelf properly. The episode placed these two deaths next to each other and let them argue with each other about what loss means. And the argument did not resolve, because the show was honest that it does not resolve. What Morty carried out of the episode was the specific knowledge that saving something is not the same as protecting it, that a moral position held consistently produces outcomes indistinguishable from a moral position abandoned, and that the universe does not adjust its carpet inventory based on how recently someone beat cancer. The stare out the ship window was the stare of a person who understood that the education cost more than it had any right to cost, and who could not identify a different choice that would have produced a different result. Rick sat beside him without comment. The show let the silence run, and somewhere, in a dimension accessible only through a headset at blips and chits, Roy Parsons was already accumulating dust on the floor of the store he came back to after he got off the carpet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Morty learned in one episode what a conscience extracts when it operates honestly in a universe built on chaos. The essay turns next to a place where that chaos was institutionalized, the citadel of Ricks, and the deaths of the figures who fell through the cracks of a civilization built entirely around a name that was supposed to guarantee something. Section 6. The Forgotten Ones. A civilization built entirely from versions of the same two people should, in theory, be a civilization without inequality. Every Rick shares the same baseline intelligence, the same genetic architecture, the same capacity for the kind of brilliance that the multiverse treats as a scarce and precious resource. Every Morty shares the same nervous system, the same fundamental makeup, the same potential for growth and feeling that makes him useful to the Ricks who move through the multiverse with him. If the premise of the Citadel means anything as a thought experiment, it means that here, finally, is a society where the usual accidents of birth and circumstance cannot produce a permanent underclass, because everyone started from the same place. The third season episode that turns the camera on this civilization and holds it steady for 22 uninterrupted minutes is one of the most damning pieces of television the show ever produced. Because what the camera finds is that the Citadel reproduced every hierarchy, every brutality, and every casual expenditure of human life that any other civilization has ever managed, using only two people as its raw material. The deaths in this episode are not the explosive, spectacular kind. They are the quieter kind. The kind that happen when a system decides that certain lives are cheaper than others, and builds its infrastructure around that decision. They are the deaths of people the institution has already decided do not count fully, and the show staged them without fanfare or dramatic scoring, because the point was precisely that the system treats them as unremarkable. Something that is unremarkable in the world of the episode should feel unremarkable to the audience watching it. And the genius of the Ricklantis mix-up is that it builds the audience into the institution's logic
logic before it shows them what the institution does to the people at the bottom of it. Campaign manager Morty was a true believer. He had attached himself to the campaign of candidate Morty with genuine conviction. The belief that a Morty running for the presidency of the Citadel represented something real, a shift in the order that had kept every Morty in a subordinate position since the society was founded. He managed the campaign with the specific energy of someone who has decided that this particular thing matters and has organized his whole purpose around making it succeed. When candidate Morty fired him backstage after winning the debate, the dismissal landed as a comedy beat at first, a sharp turn that recharacterized the candidate without changing the audience's understanding of what the campaign meant. Campaign manager Morty still believed. He had been fired, but not disillusioned. And when a figure in a trench coat approached him with files suggesting that candidate Morty was not who he appeared to be, the belief that something important was happening and that someone needed to expose it was still intact. He was led to an airlock and spaced before he could tell anyone what the files contained. The show staged this with the same flat procedural efficiency that the Citadel brought to every transaction. Two Secret Service Ricks discussing operational matters in calm tones, while the airlock completed its function. The Morty who had organized his purpose around a cause that turned out to be a trap for exactly his kind of earnestness was removed from the station without ceremony, his body joining the field of corpses that the final shots of the episode revealed floating in the space outside the Citadel's airlocks, a visible accumulation of everyone the institution had quietly discarded over its history. The episode did not cut away before showing the field. It held on it. The field was the argument. Rick J22 worked a stamping machine on a factory floor that produced simple Rick wafers, a snack product built on the psychic residue of a Rick who had chosen family over genius and was now kept in a chamber, his happiest memory played on a loop, his emotional resonance harvested to flavor a cookie. The factory Rick had been passed over for a promotion in favor of a newer Rick whose primary qualification was being effortlessly cool, a quality that had nothing to do with competence and everything to do with the specific social currency the Citadel had decided mattered. The promotion system rewarded surface rather than substance, which meant the Ricks who worked steadily and competently were consistently outmaneuvered by the ones who performed the right kind of confidence. Rick J22 had watched this happen and accumulated the specific exhaustion of a person who understands the system well enough to see how it fails them and cannot change anything about it regardless. He snapped during an announcement about the promotion he did not receive, ran to the chamber holding Simple Rick, and took the captive Rick hostage, becoming what the Citadel's news broadcasts immediately labeled the Tarot Rick. The hostage situation was real, but the frame the institution put around it was the point. A worker who objected to the conditions of his exploitation became, in the institution's language, a terrorist the moment he stopped complying. His demands were not covered. His argument, which he made clearly and at some length to the negotiating team, was not transmitted. The Citadel's media apparatus converted the event into a security incident the moment it became politically inconvenient, because a worker with a legitimate grievance is a story about the institution's failure, and the institution did not carry those stories. The negotiation ended when a SWAT Rick arrived and freed Simple Rick at the cost of Rick J22's life. The SWAT Rick was celebrated. The factory returned to production. Simple Rick went back into the chamber. The cookie tasted the same. The show presented the entire sequence with the rhythm of something that happens in systems all the time. A worker's death treated as a security outcome rather than a human cost. The machinery of the institution resuming before the body was cold. No character paused to name what had been lost. The episode did not editorialize. The flatness was the editorial. Cop Rick was the episode's most conventional figure, a new recruit whose idealism had not yet been worn down to the cynicism the job expected. He arrived at his assignment expecting the Citadel's law enforcement to function as law enforcement, to investigate crimes and protect inhabitants and operate within something resembling ethical boundaries. His partner Cop Morty was a veteran of the institution who had absorbed it entirely, who had arrived at the position of hating Mortys more than many Ricks did, who had made himself useful to the system by internalizing the system's contempt for his own category. The show has done this portrait before in other contexts. The member of an oppressed group who adopts the oppressor's framework as a survival strategy, and then cannot stop adopting it even when the survival pressure is gone. Cop Morty was that portrait in concentrated form, a Morty who tased Mortys in the street while discussing their inherent inferiority. What Cop Morty did when the case they were investigating led them to a drug lord named Big Morty was to detonate the building with the arrested gang members still inside. He destroyed the evidence, eliminated the witnesses, protected the arrangement he had made with Big Morty that kept the peace in Mortytown at the cost of participating in the system that exploited it, and then turned his gun on Cop Rick when Cop Rick refused the bribe and refused
forced to look away. Cop Rick killed him in the standoff. The episode then cut to Cop Rick surrendering to the arriving police, alone, in the aftermath of a situation that had eliminated everyone else involved. And the image of him there, badge still on, hands up, having survived a confrontation that destroyed everything around him without resolving anything, was the episode's clearest portrait of what institutional survival costs the people inside an institution that should not exist. The 4 Mortys at the school were the episode's smallest story and its most precisely aimed. They were students, assigned to the Morty Academy that prepared them for lives as sidekicks to whatever Rick the Citadel paired them with, and they spent the episode on an adventure to find the Wishing Portal, a legendary location where a person could throw in something precious and have a wish granted. The adventure was played in the register of a coming-of-age film, the specific genre the show was clearly parodying, and like every good parody, it understood the thing it was parodying well enough to make the subversion hurt. The 4 Mortys had their adventure, faced their obstacles, found the portal, threw in their precious objects, and made their wishes. Slick Morty, the rebel of the group, threw himself in to wish for change at the Citadel, sacrificing himself for his wish in the cleanest possible echo of every story in which the innocent sacrifice matters. The portal was a garbage dump. The show revealed this without softening it, without a comedic deflation that would have given the moment a landing other than the one it intended. Slick Morty's sacrifice was a garbage dump. The wishes were garbage. The adventure that felt like it was building toward a discovery worth having, built toward a hole full of refuse that has been accepting precious things from desperate Mortys for as long as the Citadel has existed. The genre being parodied is not science fiction or adventure. It is hope, specifically the hope of the people at the bottom of a hierarchy, that the hierarchy contains within it some mechanism for its own correction. The show's answer was that it does not, and that the mechanism the oppressed are encouraged to believe in is where their most precious things go to disappear. The final revelation, that candidate Morty was evil Morty, the one-eyed figure from the first season episode that had been running a multi-seasonal plan toward exactly this outcome, reframes every death in the episode in a specific direction. Campaign manager Morty died to protect a secret that evil Morty was keeping. Rick J22 died in a hostage situation that arose partly from the conditions evil Morty's campaign was promising to address. The earnestness of the episode's true believers, the Mortys who voted for change, the Ricks who put up banners reading, "Proud of my grandson," was fuel for a plan they did not know they were part of. Evil Morty used the grief of the oppressed as a vehicle for his own escape from the system, and the deaths that happened in the orbit of that vehicle were the cost of the escape that only he was making. The field of bodies floating outside the airlocks in the episode's final images is the image the show chose to close on before cutting back to Rick and Morty returning cheerfully from Atlantis, satisfied with their trip, told by Rick that the Citadel would never affect their lives. The contrast between the field and the portal, between the accumulated dead and the 2 figures walking through a door to somewhere better, was the show's plainest statement about the cost of a civilization built in someone else's name. Rick founded the Citadel. Rick left it. The field outside the airlocks was still accumulating when he stepped through the portal, and the show made sure to put both images in the same episode, in that order, so the relationship between them was impossible to miss. What distinguishes the Citadel deaths from every other category of loss in this essay is that they are systemic rather than personal. Diane's death was targeted. Birdperson's death was a betrayal. The deaths in Morty Night Run were the consequence of specific choices by a specific person. The deaths in the Ricklantis mix-up are the consequence of a structure, a society organized around principles that guarantee that some of its members will be spent, and no individual choice made by any individual character within the episode was sufficient to prevent them. Cop Rick's idealism did not save the gang members in the building. Campaign manager Morty's conviction did not survive the airlock. Rick J22's legitimate grievance did not survive the SWAT team. Slick Morty's sacrifice did not survive the garbage dump. The institution metabolized every individual act of conscience or resistance and continued, because institutions built to serve the interests of those at the top are not corrected by the heroism of those at the bottom. They are corrected, if they are corrected at all, from outside, which is precisely what evil Morty eventually did, and the correction did not improve the lives of the people who died waiting for it. The Citadel is the show's portrait of what happens when the logic Rick applies to individual relationships is applied to an entire civilization. He treats people as useful until they are not. He builds structures to serve his purposes and abandons them when the purposes change. He founded a society of his own duplicates and walked away from it when it became inconvenient, leaving it to develop interests of its own that he would eventually have to reckon with. The people who died inside that society, the Mortys in the airlock field, the factory Rick who objected
reacted to his conditions, the campaign manager who carried files he was never allowed to deliver, were the cost of a civilization Rick built and left. And the show placed their deaths in the same episode as his cheerful return from Atlantis to make sure the accounting was visible, even if the accountant was not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
The Citadel showed what happens when Rick's pattern of use and abandonment scales to the size of a civilization. The essay turns next to the deaths that never produced a body, the losses of self that the show staged as comedy and meant as horror, the episodes where a character survived intact and something essential did not. Section 7. The deaths that left no body. Grief requires a grave. That is the expectation every culture has built into its relationship with loss. The idea that something worth mourning will leave behind a visible absence, a marker, a space that used to be occupied and now is not. Rick and Morty spent 6 sections of this essay working within that expectation, examining the deaths that produced bodies, the deaths that left a family without a father, a man without a best friend, a boy who had to dig a hole and fill it. This section turns to the category of loss the show invented specifically to work outside that expectation, the deaths that leave no body behind because the thing that died was not a body to begin with. The show has produced some of its most disturbing and carefully considered losses in this register, staging the destruction of a self, an identity, a version of a person, with the same weight it brought to every loss that left a corpse, and in certain cases, with considerably more. Tiny Rick announced itself as a comedy from its opening minutes. Big Trouble in Little Sanchez placed Rick inside a high school as a teenage version of himself, grown in a cloned body built young, the transfer of consciousness handled with the casual competence that the inventor tier applies to everything biological. The premise generated jokes at a reliable rate. The young body was physically capable and socially fluent in the way teenage bodies tend to be, and the Rick mind inside it adapted quickly to the performance of youthful enthusiasm, producing a version of the character that the school's students found compelling and magnetic, a cool older person made young, the kind of figure every high school contains one of and organizes itself around. Tiny Rick became a phenomenon at Harry Herpson High within what appeared to be a matter of days, and the show played this for every comedic note available while something else was happening underneath. The something else was that the young brain was beginning to win. A mind inhabiting a body uses the body's chemistry whether it plans to or not, and a 60-year-old consciousness inside a 17-year-old endocrine system was not going to stay 60 for long. The original Rick, the identity that had entered the young body fully formed and fully himself, began losing ground to the version of himself that the young brain's chemistry was producing, a version lighter and simpler and far less interested in the darkness the original carried everywhere. The trapped original could not speak directly. The young brain controlled the mouth, the face, the posture, the instinctive reaches toward popularity and ease that the teenage chemistry demanded. What remained of the real Rick was the ability to signal, and the signals came out as song lyrics and drawings, specific choices of music that carried weight the smiling surface face could not, messages embedded in art because art was the only channel the young brain had not yet sealed. Summer and Morty encountered these signals and initially read them as quirks, as the offbeat creative expression of an unusually charismatic teenager. It took time to understand they were reading distress calls from a man trapped behind a face that had forgotten it was a mask. The rescue required Beth and Summer to force the transfer back, to insist on returning the old Rick to the old body over the enthusiastic objections of Tiny Rick, who wanted nothing more than to remain young and popular and free of the weight the original carried. Tiny Rick did not want to be saved, because Tiny Rick did not experience himself as a prison. From inside the young brain's chemistry, the older self's pain did not register as something real and legitimate that deserved to be returned to. It registered as a problem that had been solved. The show played the transfer as relief and as loss simultaneously, because what was being restored was a man who would now return to being in pain, and what was being lost was a version of him that had been genuinely happy, genuinely light, genuinely capable of enjoying a school dance without the full apparatus of his damage running in the background. The clone body had offered him something the real body could not, and the price of choosing the real body was choosing to carry everything the clone was so cheerfully free of. Tiny Rick died when the consciousness transferred out, and something worth grieving died with him, not because the version was better than the original, but because the freedom from pain it represented was real, and the show was honest about that without letting it become an argument for staying young and popular at the cost of yourself. Rest and Ricklaxation staged the same split in a different register, taking Rick and Morty to an alien spa that separated each of them from their toxic selves rather
rather than their young selves, producing two distinct pairs where there had been one. The toxic Rick contained everything Rick had buried, the cruelty and the self-loathing and the fear and the raw need he spent every waking hour routing out of any visible expression. And the toxic version ran free in the world, while the healthy version functioned as a cleaner and more pleasant person, more genuinely open, easier to be around, recognizably Rick, but without the damage. The healthy version attended a business meeting. He made friends. He spoke about his feelings with the directness of someone who has no practiced defense against the act of speaking about them. And the people around him responded to the openness with warmth, because openness invites warmth in a way that performance never does.
The show gave this version enough screen time that the audience could feel what Rick might have become in the absence of everything that scarred him, and then it folded him back into the original. The healthy Rick was not a better Rick in any simple sense. The show was deliberate about this distinction, making it plain that the toxic elements being extracted were not merely vices but structural components, things that had become load-bearing parts of who he was through decades of experience that could not simply be removed without consequences. A Rick without the self-loathing was a Rick without the protective shell the self-loathing maintained. A Rick without the fear was a Rick without the vigilance the fear had always powered. The reintegration was not triumphant. What the episode established in its quietest and most precise moment was that Rick already knew everything the toxic self contained. He was not unaware of his own self-loathing or his own fear. He had always seen himself clearly, and what the meta-mind supplied was not the capacity for self-knowledge, but the capacity to convert self-knowledge into a more sophisticated defense. The death of the version that could have been, the healthier Rick briefly walking around in the world, was the episode's real loss, quiet and unremarked and complete. The night after Unity left is the section's most carefully handled subject. Autoerotic assimilation brought Rick face to face with a former partner whose entire nature was the absorption of other minds into a unified will, a being who controlled entire planets by making their inhabitants part of herself, and the relationship between them worked precisely because both were creatures who reshaped everyone around them toward their own needs. Unity left because she recognized that Rick made her worse, that the version of herself she became in his presence was destructive in ways she could not survive, and the admission was the most damning assessment of Rick that any character in the series had offered by that point in the run. A being that assimilated worlds acknowledged that he was the more consuming force. The episode followed him back to the garage after she was gone. He sat at the bench. He worked slowly, assembling something small and deliberate, and in the middle of the work he turned to a creature he had been keeping nearby, a small, suffering animal, and offered it something careful and final, ending its pain with a gentleness that the show staged without commentary because the gesture needed no commentary. Then he turned the same instrument toward himself. He did not succeed. The device fired at nothing. He was already unconscious from the drinking, slumped across the bench, alive by the margin of his own worst habits catching up to him before his most deliberate ones could. The body survived the night. What did not survive was the fiction that the armor was impenetrable. Something died in the garage that night, without the body dying with it, and the show honored that death by refusing to explain it away in the episode that followed, by letting it sit in the record as the truest single image of what accumulating loss does to a person who has no vocabulary for carrying it. The series would return to the detail obliquely, through the lens of every subsequent episode in which Rick's nihilism was treated as a worldview rather than a symptom, but the garage was always underneath it, the floor the whole performance was built on. Morty's deaths of self are less concentrated than Rick's, less dramatic in their staging, and more total in their accumulated effect. The boy who appeared in the pilot was frightened of everything, eager to please, easy to wound, incapable of the kind of coldness that the adventures kept requiring of him and supplying anyway. The boy who appeared 6 episodes later, bearing his own corpse to Mazzy's star, had already absorbed a change that the earlier version could not have survived without becoming someone slightly different. Each subsequent season delivered another alteration, another layer of the original softness replaced by something harder and more capable, and considerably less comfortable to be around. The Vat of Acid episode in the 4th season staged one of the sharpest of these changes, building Morty an entire life through a secret device that allowed him to checkpoint reality and rewind to saved moments. He used it recklessly, carelessly, with the specific carelessness of someone who has been given a consequence-free existence and has not yet understood that consequence-free existences are the most expensive kind. He met a person. He loved her in the way that people love when the love is allowed to develop slowly, across shared experiences that accumulate into something real and unrepeatable. And the relationship was genuine on both sides, built through the kind of friction
connection and recovery, and small acts of loyalty that produce actual intimacy rather than its simulation. When Rick revealed the cost of every checkpoint, every restored save, every moment Morty had treated as reversible, the revelation was that the people in the erased timelines were real. Each restoration had killed everyone in the discarded version. He had not been living consequence-free. He had been living in a debt that came due all at once. And the version of Morty who walked out of that episode was not the version who had walked in, because the version who had walked in had not yet looked at what he was capable of when given permission not to look. Beth's clone situation is the section's most philosophical death of self, because what died was not a version of Beth, but the possibility of certainty about which version is real. Rick offered to clone her, randomized the two versions so that neither would know which was original, and then erased his own knowledge to guarantee that even he could not resolve the ambiguity. Both Beths woke up the morning after the procedure in lives that were either entirely theirs or entirely borrowed, with no way to tell the difference and no authority to appeal to for the answer. The original Beth was a specific person in a specific life with a specific claim to continuity. Both Beths are now specific people in specific lives with identical claims, and the death of the certainty that one of them is more real than the other is a loss with no grave and no marker and no way to mourn it cleanly, because it is impossible to mourn a self you cannot confirm exists. Mortiplicity, the 5th season episode that revealed Rick had seeded his life with multiple decoy families, complete households of duplicate people arranged to absorb attacks intended for the real family, extended the same logic to its most disturbing conclusion. The decoys believed they were real. They had no way to know otherwise, had been given every memory and every attachment and every unresolved feeling of the originals, and moved through their lives with the full weight of genuine personhood. When the decoys began attacking each other in an escalating cascade of households, each convinced the others were the fakes, the deaths that resulted were the deaths of beings who had been manufactured to die in place of someone else, built to be spent, and who were spending their brief existence trying to prevent exactly the death they had been designed for. Rick had loved his family enough to make copies of them, and arranged for the copies to die instead. The copies had enough of the family in them to fight for their lives with everything they had. The deaths of self in this episode were the deaths of dozens of almost Beths and almost Mortys and almost Summers, each one real enough to want to live, and not real enough for the show to give the wanting a name. The accumulation of these losses across the series produces a portrait that the individual episodes only partially reveal. Taken together, the deaths of self that Rick and Morty has staged over its run describe the cost of a universe built around a man who treats identity as a material to be worked with rather than a fact to be honored. Rick clones and transfers and splits and extracts because the technology makes these things possible and his philosophy makes them logical, and the people who are loved or copied or altered inside that philosophy pay the price of living in a world where the self is not protected by its own uniqueness. The graves for these losses do not exist because the show refuses to build them, and the refusal is the argument. The insistence that a loss without a visible marker is still a loss, and that a civilization or a family or a boy organized around a man who makes that kind of loss routine will eventually find that the thing it is losing is itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The deaths of self showed what the show could lose without leaving a body behind. The slow replacement of one person by another wearing the same face. The essay turns next to the death the whole series was building toward, the one Rick organized his entire existence around, and the silence that followed when it finally arrived. Section 8. What victory sounds like decades. The show never provides an exact count, but the accounting across several seasons of revealed history makes clear that Rick C-137 spent the better part of his adult life in pursuit of the man who killed his wife. The hunt organized everything. It explained the portal gun, which was built partly to make the search possible. It explained the Citadel, which was built partly to give the search infrastructure. It explained the choice to move into Rick Prime's abandoned family's home, which was built on the calculated bet that the target would eventually return to his original dimension and could be ambushed there. The hunt explained the drinking, which kept the grief at a manageable distance, while the purpose the hunt supplied kept the days from being shapeless. It explained the relationships held at arm's length, the family managed rather than loved, the friendships maintained within the limits of what a man on a decades-long mission could afford to feel. Everything about Rick C-137, every habit and every wall and every piece of technology built in the garage on a Tuesday afternoon was downstream of one decision made by one version of himself in one dimension, the decision to find Rick Prime and end him, and to build a life around the finding rather than around anything else. The confrontation finally arrived in the 7th season episode Unmortrican, the 5th episode of the season, which was earlier than most audience members expected, and earlier than the show's own structural logic seemed to require. A hunt that had been running for most of the series could reasonably have been expected to serve as the season finale, the culmination of a multi-season arc delivered at the largest possible moment. The show placed it at episode 5 deliberately, which the showrunners later confirmed was a choice made to give the season room to deal with what happened after victory, rather than cutting to credits on the victory itself. The decision was correct, and it was also, in the framing of this essay, the most important structural choice the series ever made about this particular subject, because it announced clearly that the death of Rick Prime was not the ending the show had been building toward. It was the middle of a different story. Rick Prime was not easy to find, even after a lifetime of searching, and the breakthrough came from a direction Rick could not have arranged alone. Evil Morty, the one-eyed figure whose multi-seasonal plan had already dismantled the central finite curve and claimed the Omega device schematics, arrived at Rick's lab with an observation about how to adjust the scanner that had been searching for Rick Prime's signal, and the adjustment worked where years of searching had not. The assistance was not offered from affection. Evil Morty had his own reasons for wanting Rick Prime found and dealt with, reasons connected to the Omega device and its capacity to erase people from every reality simultaneously, a weapon that threatened him as much as anyone. The alliance was a transaction between two beings who found their interests aligned on a single narrow point, and both of them understood it as such, and neither pretended otherwise. Rick Prime, when the tracking finally locked onto his location, was not found in the middle of a dramatic operation or a grand scheme. He was simply present at his lair, running the machinery of his continued existence, the backups and the contingencies and the cold infrastructure of a man who had built his life around staying alive and unpunished for as long as he chose. The lair contained the Omega device, the weapon that had erased Diane from every reality, and Rick Prime seemed comfortable with the proximity, comfortable in the way that a person is comfortable when the thing that gives them power has never been seriously threatened. He called Rick Dead Wife Rick when he appeared, a summary of the other man's entire story, delivered in 3 words as contempt, the most efficient possible dismissal of a lifetime of suffering as someone else's sentimental weakness. Before anything else happened, before any fight or exchange or resolution, Rick Prime killed Slow Mobius. He used the Omega device, and he did it in front of Rick, demonstrating the weapon's function with a being he described as someone he had some genuine feeling for, saying the words while the erasure was already running, admitting the cost of what he was doing without letting the admission slow the doing. Slow Mobius disappeared from every reality simultaneously. The being who had existed in every dimension he had ever been present in simply stopped existing in all of them at once, retroactively removed from every timeline without wreckage or remains, the way a thought disappears rather than the way a body dies. Rick watched this happen. The show held on his face for the duration of the erasure, which was brief because the Omega device was efficient and Rick Prime was not interested in theater. The demonstration was over in seconds. What the show understood about that moment, and what the staging made clear, is that the death of Slow Mobius was not primarily about Slow Mobius. The audience had seen the character in passing across the seasons, a figure from Rick's earlier life who had not been developed into a presence the audience would grieve for independently. His erasure was designed to be felt through Rick, as a preview of what Rick Prime was capable of and willing to do, as proof that the weapon Rick had spent years trying to find and neutralize could be deployed instantly and totally against anyone in Rick's orbit. The demonstration was a threat expressed as an action, a message delivered in the form of a murder, and Rick received it as both, understanding simultaneously that someone he had known was gone and that the same device was pointed at everyone else he had ever allowed himself to care about. Evil Morty's role in what followed was the episode's most structurally surprising element, and, on reflection, its most thematically appropriate. Rick Prime had a blind spot. He believed, as all the Ricks within the curve believed at some level, that a Morty was a known quantity, predictable and manageable, and not a figure around whom a serious plan could be built. Evil Morty had been building his entire existence around the exploitation of that blind spot since his first appearance in the first season, and he exploited it one final time here by swapping his own clothes with Morty's and approaching Rick Prime as though he were the man's original grandson, allowing Prime's assumption to bring him close enough to be restrained. The trap worked because Rick Prime could not fully shake the curve's logic even at the moment it was being used against him, and Evil Morty used the window it provided to erase Rick Prime's backup clones, the copies and contingencies that had kept him effectively immortal for decades, removing them from existence resistance before dragging Rick's body into the room and reviving him. Evil Morty offered Rick free reign then. He had done what he needed from the Alliance. The Omega device schematics were his. Rick Prime was restrained, and his backups were gone, and the man who had organized Rick C-137's entire life around a mission now had the mission delivered to him in a room he had not built. Rick Prime, restrained in a chair, continued talking. He mocked. He called Rick Dead Wife Rick again, and variations on the phrase, turning the grief into a label he could use to diminish the man standing over him. He told Rick that pursuing revenge had made Rick into him, that the decades of single-minded pursuit of another person across the multiverse was not the behavior of a grieving husband, but of a specific kind of damaged intelligence, his kind, and that Rick should look at himself clearly before claiming the moral difference between them was real. He said this while being beaten. He kept saying it. He did not stop saying it. Rick beat Rick Prime to death with his hands. The show staged this slowly by its standards, giving the sequence enough time that the brutality of it was not quick or clean or narratively convenient. This was not the efficient elimination of a villain at the end of a confrontation. This was a man who had waited decades for a specific act of violence and was now performing it without the speed that adrenaline and tactical necessity usually provide. The kind of sustained violence that belongs to grief rather than to combat. The kind that is still running on feeling long after the practical purpose has been served. Rick Prime was dead well before Rick stopped. The mocking stopped when the body stopped, and the room was quiet afterward in a way that Rick had presumably been imagining for most of his adult life. The quiet was wrong. This is what the show's structural decision to place the confrontation at episode 5 rather than episode 10 was designed to reveal, and the reveal was immediate and unambiguous. Rick stood in the room with the body of the man he had spent decades hunting and felt nothing that resembled what the hunt had promised. The grief was still there. The loss of Diane was still there. The loss of Slow Mobius was still there. The loss of every dimension and every relationship and every ordinary life that the hunt had displaced was still there. And the body of Rick Prime did not address any of it, because none of it had ever actually been about Rick Prime. The mission had been about the grief, and the grief did not care about the mission's completion. It had simply been waiting for the mission to end so it could be heard again. Morty found him in the aftermath, and the show gave the scene exactly the weight it required. Rick was visibly, uncomplicatedly lost. Not tortured in the romantic sense, not processing dramatically, simply lost in the way that a person is lost when the organizing principle of their life has been removed and nothing has been arranged to replace it. He did not know what to do next, and he said so, and the admission carried the exhaustion of a man who had been doing one thing for so long that doing had become the substitute for living rather than a part of it. The hunt had kept the days from being shapeless. Now the days had no shape, and the grief that the hunt had been holding at a functional distance was no longer being held. Morty's response to this was the episode's final and most important beat. He did not offer wisdom or comfort in any form the audience might have expected. He did not summarize what the hunt had meant, or suggest that the victory represented healing, or suggest that what came next was a new chapter. He told Rick they should go on an adventure, and the simplicity of the suggestion carried everything it needed to. Not because adventure was a cure, because presence was the only available alternative to absence, and the person offering the presence was the one Rick had kept closest for the longest, through all the management and the manipulation and the camouflage. And what was being offered now was simply continuation. The ordinary fact of being somewhere with someone who knew the whole history and had decided to keep showing up anyway. The episode that followed the hunt's conclusion did not rush Rick toward recovery. The season's remaining episodes dealt with the aftermath in the register of a man who had won something and did not know what to do in winning's wake, which is a more honest account of how significant losses leave a person than the dramatic arcs most fiction supplies. The Fear Hole episode, the season finale, eventually gave Rick the closest thing the series had offered to a real engagement with Diane's absence, through the mechanism of the fear hole that produced a version of her and then turned out never to have been Rick's fear at all. The revelation that Rick had not entered the fear hole was its own statement about his continued inability to fully sit in the loss. But his decision not to jump in afterward, when he knew what was waiting inside, was the first choice in the season that was not organized around the hunt or its aftermath. He left a photo of Morty on the board. He walked away. The episode framed the gesture as small and tentative and real, which was the register appropriate to a man who had just lost the structure his grief had been hiding behind and was trying, slowly and without any particular confidence, to figure out what a life looks like without it. Rick Prime's death is unique among the deaths in this essay because it is the death the audience was rooting for and the death that delivered the least. Every other loss examined across these sections produced grief that had no outlet. outlet, grief that accumulated and looked for somewhere to go and found only more loss to add to the pile. Rick Prime's death produced the opposite, a victory that arrived at the exact location where grief had been stored and found the grief waiting there, unchanged, fully intact, patient in the way that real losses are patient, content to wait through any distraction until the distraction ends. Decades of brilliant planning and brutal sacrifice, and the construction of an entire mythology around the hunt. And the grief on the other side of the hunt's completion was the same grief that had been there on the first morning after the bomb drop. Rick Prime knew this. He said it while being beaten, the claim that pursuing revenge had made Rick into him. And the claim was not entirely wrong, even if the framing was designed to wound rather than to illuminate. A man who spent 40 years doing one thing, who built every relationship and every institution and every piece of technology around the doing of that one thing, had become the doing of that thing more than he had become anything else. The hunt was the man for most of the run of the show, which means that what died in the room with Rick Prime was not only the villain who had organized the hunt. What died was the version of Rick whose life was organized around catching Rick Prime. And the question the remaining episodes of the season were asking was what version would emerge from the space that the death left open. The answer the show supplied was modest and honest, and refused to be more than it was. Rick went on adventures with Morty. He sat in a fear hole's aftermath and decided not to jump in. He moved forward in the specific way that people move forward when moving forward is all that remains. Not because the grief was resolved, but because the alternative to moving forward is standing still in the room where the hunt ended. And standing still in that room was not going to bring Diane back any more than the hunt had. Rick Prime died on the floor of his own lair, and the universe did not reorganize itself around the fact of his death. And the man who killed him walked out of the room into a universe that was identical in every material respect to the one he had walked in from, carrying the same loss and the same damage and the same unspoken grief that had been there since an afternoon in Dimension C-137 before the show began. The sound of winning, as the show staged it, was silence. Not the silence of resolution or peace or a story that has reached its ending. The silence of a room after the thing that was making noise has stopped, before anything else has started. The silence that lives between the old shape and the new one, which is the longest and most honest silence any story has to offer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The hunt ended, and the silence it left was the shape of everything the hunt had been hiding from. The essay turns next to the full accounting, all the costs laid together in a single view, and what the show has been arguing across every death in this record about what it means to survive them. Section 9. What the living carry. Start with Morty, because Morty is the most complete record the show keeps of what accumulated loss does to a person when the loss is never fully processed and never stops arriving. He is the only character in the series whose transformation is visible from episode 1 across every subsequent season in a way that allows the audience to track the specific cost of each death in the sequence, to see the before and the after, and to understand what sits between them. Rick's damage predates the show. Beth's damage predates most of the relevant events. Summer develops across the seasons, but in a register the show uses less consistently as a measure. Morty is the chart, the running record, the portrait of a person being changed by loss in real time across a decade of television. And what the chart shows is not recovery or growth in any conventional sense, but a steady replacement of one kind of person by another, carried out incrementally and irreversibly, one death at a time. The pilot Morty was frightened of everything. He stumbled through the first adventure because Rick needed his brainwave interference for cover, and because Rick had decided, with the cold pragmatism the show later confirmed as the actual foundation of the relationship, that a Morty in tow was the most effective camouflage available. The boy who showed up in that first episode had not been selected for courage or capability. He had been selected for his brain signature. He was nervous and eager and desperately wanted to be useful, and the wanting was so visible in every scene that it functioned as the show's clearest early statement about what Rick was working with and what that meant for the boy doing the work. 6 episodes in, that boy buried his own corpse. He did not cry during the burial because the show understood that what he was experiencing was not grief in any form he had vocabulary for. It was closer to the specific numbness that arrives when a situation exceeds the capacity of the available emotional framework, when what is happening is so far outside anything the person has been prepared for that the feeling system simply suspends itself and waits waits for a context in which to resume. The 1,000-yard stare was the accurate representation of a nervous system that had reached its ceiling and was standing very still while it figured out what kind of person it now had to be. The kind of person who has buried their own face and moved into a borrowed house and will spend the rest of their life in a family that is technically not theirs, in a room that used to belong to someone who died in an explosion trying to fix a problem that this Morty caused. That is the ground floor.
That is where Morty's record begins, and everything that follows is built on that foundation of early and formative and entirely unprocessed trauma that the show never fully addressed in therapy and never fully released through any other mechanism available to the character. The fart decision added the knowledge that a conscience does not protect against complicity, that the most sincere moral position held consistently across an entire episode can produce outcomes indistinguishable from having no moral position at all. The vat of acid episode added the knowledge that he was capable of a specific kind of carelessness with other people's lives when given permission not to look at the cost, that the version of himself who would fall in love genuinely and then erase the people connected to that love rather than give up the device that made it feel consequence-free was available and present, and not as different from Rick as he needed to believe. Planetina added the knowledge that the person he loved was capable of a violence he could not follow her into, that loving someone does not guarantee that person will remain someone you can love without conditions, and that the end of that kind of love does not arrive cleanly. Each edition landed on top of the previous ones without displacing them, because the show did not give Morty the mechanisms for displacement. He had no functional therapy, no genuine sustained support, no relationship with another person that operated on genuinely equal terms rather than on the terms Rick had established. He had the adventures, which kept arriving, and the accumulation, which kept compounding. By the later seasons, the Morty doing the adventuring was not the Morty of the pilot in any way that could be called superficial. The nervousness was gone, the eagerness had curdled into something more conditional and more watchful. He knew things that 14-year-olds should not know, had done things that most adults never do, and had absorbed the philosophy of a man who treated the multiverse as a sourcebook of replaceable realities without fully internalizing it in the way Rick had, which left him in the specific position of knowing the nihilism intellectually and still being wounded by every individual loss as though meaning were real and specific and personal. That position is arguably more painful than either alternative. A person who fully believed nothing mattered would stop being hurt by the deaths. A person who fully believed everything mattered would at least have a coherent framework for the grief. Morty occupied the middle space, too shaped by Rick's worldview to sustain the original innocence, and too human to stop caring about the specific things that were lost. And the show staged that position with accuracy and without resolution across the full run. Rick's record across the deaths in this essay is structured differently, because Rick's damage is older and more thoroughly defended, and expressed less through visible transformation than through the consistent pattern of what he builds and what he avoids. He does not visibly change across the seasons the way Morty does, partly because the change in him happened before the show began, and what the audience is watching is the aftermath of that change rather than the change itself, and partly because a man who is sufficiently skilled at managing his own presentation can maintain the appearance of stasis across a very long time. The drinking is the most consistent external signal. It is present in virtually every scene across the entire run, always proximate to his hands, always available as the first response to anything that cannot be immediately engineered away. And its constancy makes it readable not as a character quirk, but as a structural feature, the mechanism by which he keeps the pressure inside the gauge at a manageable level. Every death in this essay added pressure. The drinking was the valve. The garage is the other consistent signal, and it is the one that accumulates meaning most completely across the deaths examined here. After Diane, the garage was where he built things instead of grieving. After Unity left, and the night in the garage ended the way it did, the garage was where he nearly lost the valve entirely. After Bird Person died at the wedding, Rick surrendered to the Federation from a position that the show implied was connected to the garage logic, the understanding that he had nothing left to hold at a distance if he lost anyone else that night, and that the family's safety was the one remaining thing he could engineer rather than feel. The garage appears in this record not as a setting, but as a coping mechanism made architectural, the place a man retreats to when the feeling becomes too large for the available container, where the hands that can make anything can be put to work making something rather than sitting with the thing that can
cannot be made. The pattern that connects all the deaths is the pattern of the exit. Rick's response to Diane was to build the portal gun and begin looking for another version of the life he had lost, then to spend decades hunting the man who destroyed it, both of which were exits from the grief itself, both of which were productive and purposeful and generated enormous quantities of activity that could be mistaken for living. His response to the Cronenberg world was to portal out and leave someone else's reality to carry the consequences. His response to Bird Person's death was to surrender, which was a form of exit, removing himself from the situation before the grief of it could become undeniable in front of the people he was trying to protect. His response to The Night After Unity was the most direct collision with the impossibility of exit that the series had shown to that point. The moment when there was nowhere to portal to, and no mission to generate purpose, and no audience to perform self-sufficiency for. And the garage contained him in that moment, with nothing between him and the accumulated weight of all the previous exits and what they had been exiting from. The hunt for Rick Prime was the largest and most elaborately constructed exit of all, a mission so vast and so sustained that it functioned as both a life and a reason to have one. And the death of Rick Prime in Unmore-Tricken was the end of the exit and the arrival at what the exit had been avoiding.
The silence in the room after Rick Prime stopped moving was the silence of a man who had run out of road and was standing at the place where the road had always been heading, which was not a resolution, but a location. Not an answer, but the point where the question could no longer be deferred. Morty was there. The show did not give Rick a triumphant speech or a moment of visible catharsis or any of the markers that fiction typically supplies to indicate that a character has processed something significant. It gave him Morty suggesting they go on an adventure, and Rick accepting, because the alternative was standing still in the room, and standing still in the room was not something his nervous system had been calibrated to do. Beth's position in the accumulated record is the one the show addresses least directly and perhaps most honestly. She is the person in the story for whom the cost is oldest and most completely absorbed. The woman who built an identity around being the daughter of a genius and spent most of her adult life unable to determine whether the identity was earned or conferred. The deaths and losses of this essay are not primarily hers in terms of direct experience, but they arrive at her through Rick, and what arrives through Rick tends to reshape the people it reaches. Her uncertainty about the clone situation, about which version of herself is real, is the sharpest version of the damage, the moment when the ambiguity that had always characterized her relationship with her own identity was externalized into a literal question with no available answer. She cannot know which Beth she is. The show does not give her a method for finding out. She lives with the ambiguity, the way all the characters in this record live with their losses, by continuing to move through days that are structured around the unanswered question, rather than by resolving it. Summer, over the seasons, becomes the character the show uses to demonstrate what happens when a person who is naturally perceptive and naturally resilient is exposed to enough of Rick's world that the perception and the resilience begin to develop in directions that are not entirely healthy. She adapts quickly, more quickly than Morty, in ways that the show treats with admiration and with unease simultaneously, because the speed of the adaptation means the losses that would have stopped Morty do not stop Summer for as long, and a person who is not stopped by losses is not always a person who is processing them at a useful rate. Her arc across the later seasons moves her steadily in the direction of the person Rick already is, the person who reads every situation as a system to be navigated, and every relationship as a resource to be managed. And the show registers this movement as loss, in the specific way it registers the deaths of self that leave no body, the gradual disappearance of the version of Summer who is not yet shaped by proximity to a man whose proximity tends to shape everything around it. The show's argument about what all of these losses add up to is not the argument that loss destroys people, which would be simple and false. The people in this record are still present, still functional, still capable of the kinds of connection and humor and genuine feeling that made them worth following through 8 seasons of extraordinarily dark material. The argument is more precise than destruction. It is that loss, unprocessed, finds a home in the body and the behavior and the framework through which a person makes decisions, and that the home it finds is not a neutral one. Rick's unprocessed grief for Diane did not simply make him sad. It made him into the specific kind of person who builds a wall around infinity to guarantee that nothing surprising can reach him from outside it. The kind of person who turns a best friendship into an intelligence asset and calls it protection. The kind of person who offers his daughter a clone of herself so he never has to sit with the guilt of having missed her childhood by choosing to miss it. The grief did that. Not malevolence, not simple selfishness, not the clean villainy that would make the portrait easier to hold. The grief found a home in his intelligence, which was the
most powerful home available, and from there, it organized everything. Morty's unprocessed losses did not simply make him older.
They made him into a person with a specific and hard-won knowledge of what the universe does to people who care about things, which is that it tends not to adjust its behavior to protect the caring, and that the most reliable outcome of caring specifically and deeply is loss that is equally specific and equally deep. He knows this the way people know things that they have learned through direct experience rather than through instruction, which means the knowledge is in his bones rather than in his thinking, and it comes out not as a stated belief, but as a readiness, the specific posture of a person who is always a little prepared for the thing they are afraid of, because being a little prepared for it has historically been better than being completely surprised. Together, the survivor portraits form the show's answer to its own central question about loss and intelligence. The question the series has been asking across every death in this record is whether a mind powerful enough to understand loss clearly is also capable of processing it honestly, or whether the power of the understanding becomes the primary tool for avoiding the processing. The answer the show arrives at through 8 seasons of patient accumulation is that understanding and processing are not the same operation. That a man who can explain his own grief with perfect clarity is not a man who has done the work of carrying it. And that the intelligence that makes Rick the most powerful figure in his corner of the multiverse is the same intelligence that has made his losses the most durable and least resolvable in the record, because he has never once allowed them to be anything other than material he could analyze and route around and build something out of. The graves are the final image the essay returns to, not as a symbol, but as a fact. There is an actual grave in an actual backyard in the dimension the show has been set in since the 6th episode of the first season, occupied by the body of a Rick and a Morty who died trying to fix something that the Ricks who replaced them had broken, and the replacement pair have been living above that grave ever since. The grave is never shown after 60 minutes. The show does not return to it, does not make it a recurring visual motif, does not use it to underline moments of character reflection in the way a less confident series might. It simply exists, under the backyard, in the dirt, as the foundation of everything that has happened since. Every adventure the show has staged, every death examined in this essay, every moment of connection or loss or survival or transformation has taken place in a house built above that specific piece of ground. Rick knows it is there. Morty knows it is there. The family above it moves through their days without referencing it, the way people move through days in houses built above foundations they do not regularly inspect. The knowledge is present without being active, which is the most accurate description of how the accumulated losses of this record live in the people who survived them. Not raw and present and demanding attention, not resolved and filed and finished. Present in the structure, holding things up. The foundation of a borrowed life in a borrowed house in a reality they moved into because the one they were supposed to be in had been made uninhabitable by the very intelligence that was supposed to make everything better. What the living carry, at the end of the accounting, is not primarily memory or grief or guilt, though all three are present in the record. What they carry is the shape that loss gives to a person over time, the specific profile of the person who has absorbed this many endings in this particular sequence in the company of this specific man, and has continued to show up to the next adventure regardless. Not because the showing up is painless, but because the alternative to showing up is the garage on a specific night, and none of them have chosen the garage yet, which is the show's quietest and most sustaining statement about the people it has been following, that they keep choosing each other in the margins of every loss, imperfectly and without ceremony, and for reasons that are never fully articulated, but with enough consistency across a full run of television that the pattern amounts to something the show is willing to call a kind of love. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The accounting showed what every death in the record cost the people who survived it, the specific shape that loss leaves in a person who keeps moving. The essay turns to its final section, the question the whole record was built to ask, which is what a show about death is finally saying about how to live. Section 10, what this show was saying all along. A grave in a backyard, a bomb with a face on it, a wedding that ended before the cake was cut, a gaseous being singing a David Bowie song in a boy's head on the way to a death the boy would have to perform himself, a civilization built from two people that reproduced every hierarchy ever invented, a man in a garage on a specific night, a hunt that lasted decades and ended in a room that felt identical to the room the hunt had started from. Every death examined in this record was real within the world the show built, and every death was also an argument, a piece of evidence in a case the show has been assembling since the pilot, and the final section of this essay is concerned with what that case amounts to. The case is not about death. That is the first
first and most important clarification, the distinction that separates this show from the many other pieces of fiction that use death as a dramatic accelerant, a way of raising stakes or generating emotion or signaling that the story is willing to go to dark places. Rick and Morty uses death as a diagnostic tool. The deaths in this record are not ends, they are readings. Each one measures something about the character who experiences the loss and the character who caused it, and the relationship between those two facts. And the accumulated readings form a portrait that the individual episodes only partially reveal.
Read together, from the Cronenberg world to the room where Rick Prime stopped moving, the deaths describe not what the show is willing to do to its characters, but what the show believes about the people doing the dying and the people doing the surviving, and the space between those two activities where most of a life is actually lived. What the show believes, stated as plainly as 8 seasons of careful evidence allows, is that the capacity for grief is the truest measure of a person, and that a person who has engineered their way out of grief has not solved the problem of being human, but has instead made it permanent. Rick is the proof of this argument. He is the most powerful figure the show can construct, a mind without precedent, operating inside a universe rigged to guarantee his supremacy, and he has used every resource that combination provides to build the most sophisticated avoidance of grief ever depicted in any medium. The portal gun is a grief avoidance device. The Citadel was a grief avoidance device. The hunt for Rick Prime was a grief avoidance device. The garage is a grief avoidance device. The drinking is a grief avoidance device. The management of relationships at the exact distance where they can be useful and cannot get close is a grief avoidance device. Everything the show has spent 8 seasons presenting as evidence of Rick's genius is, from the angle this record opens up, evidence of his wound. Because the wound came first, and the genius was the most powerful instrument available for routing around it. The show makes this argument not by attacking Rick or by presenting him as a villain, but by doing something considerably more uncomfortable, which is by making him the most compelling figure in the story and then refusing to let the compellingness excuse the cost. He is brilliant, and the brilliance is real, and the audience is given full access to it across the entire run, invited to be thrilled by it and impressed by it, and occasionally grateful for it when it is pointed at something worth pointing it at. The show does not present his intelligence as a fraud or his capabilities as illusory. It presents them as genuine, and then asks what they have been used for and what they have cost the people standing in their orbit. And the answer to both questions is the same. They have been used for avoidance, and they have cost the people in his orbit the version of him that might have shown up differently, the version that the toast at Bird Person's wedding briefly revealed, present and genuine and capable of meaning it. Every death in this record is a tax on that avoidance. Diane's death was the original event, the wound around which the avoidance was first organized. But the deaths that followed were not merely Rick's fault in any simple causal sense. They are the price of a life structured around the wound rather than through it. Bird Person died in part because Rick had built his social world so narrowly that one person could function as the last witness to his previous self, making that person's death the death of something unreplaceable. The Decoy families died because Rick had converted his love for his family into a security architecture rather than a relationship, treating the people he cared about as assets to be protected rather than as people to be known, which is the specific kind of love that produces decoys rather than presence. The Morty who buried his own corpse became the Morty who could erase an entire timeline of people rather than give up a consequence-free device, because the education Rick had been providing since the pilot was an education in the dispensability of specific lives, and students tend to learn what teachers model, regardless of what teachers say. The show placed Dr. Wong in Pickle Rick for exactly this reason. She is the only character in the entire series who says the thing the show has been demonstrating since episode 6 without any of the comic deflection the other characters use to soften it. She says that the family uses intelligence to justify sickness, that the link between Rick's unquestionable brilliance and the damage visible in everyone around him is not coincidence but mechanism, and that the most unbearable idea the show's central figure has ever encountered is not death or loss or the heat death of the universe, but the simple proposal that his mind is his and within his control, and could therefore be pointed somewhere other than where he has been pointing it. She delivers this without drama and without cruelty, in the calm, professional tone of a person who has seen the pattern before and is naming it accurately. And Rick says nothing, which is the show's confirmation that the assessment landed. He has no rebuttal because there is no rebuttal. The case she makes in 5 minutes of conversation is the case this essay has been making across
10 sections, and the show built her scene to be precisely that, the place where the argument comes into the open before the characters walk out of the office and immediately begin using their intelligence to explain why they do not need to return. Beth and Jerry left that session mocking the therapist and making plans. Morty and Summer quietly said they would like to keep going. The line the show draws between those two responses is the clearest statement it makes about the inheritance Rick passes down, the specific training in avoidance that functions as the family's deepest bond and its deepest wound simultaneously. He does not teach the avoidance through instruction. He models it so completely and so consistently that the people in his orbit absorb it the way people absorb language, through exposure rather than through choice. And by the time they are old enough to recognize what they have learned, the learning is already structural, built into how they process difficulty and what they reach for when difficulty arrives. The Morty who has been most changed by this inheritance is also the Morty who has most consistently pushed back against it, and the pushback is the show's sustaining counter-argument to its own central thesis. Every section of this essay has documented a death or a loss that moved in one direction, the direction of hardening, the direction of the lesson that caring produces costs that caring cannot cover. Morty has absorbed every one of those lessons and has not fully accepted any of them, which is the specific stubbornness the show treats as the closest thing to heroism it is willing to offer. He keeps caring about specific things. He keeps being hurt by specific losses. He keeps showing up in the aftermath of experiences that should have finished the project of making him more like Rick, and remaining, imperfectly and incompletely, but visibly, more like himself. The Fear Hole episode staged his greatest fear as the fear of relying on Rick, the fear that Rick would leave him, and his overcoming of that fear was not the discovery that Rick would never leave, but the discovery that the fear itself did not have to organize everything. He could rely on Rick, and know that Rick might leave and continue anyway, which is the show's most mature statement about what it means to love a person who is genuinely difficult to love without conditions. Rick's equivalent moment, standing at the edge of the fear hole and deciding not to jump in, was smaller and less resolved and exactly the right size. He did not conquer his grief. He did not process the loss of Diane, or arrive at peace with it, or find a new framework that made the 40 years of avoidance intelligible as something other than what they were. He stood at the edge of a hole that could give him a version of her, and chose not to enter it because entering it would have been one more elaborate device for being near the loss without being inside it, the most sophisticated grief avoidance mechanism he had ever encountered. And he had enough self-knowledge in that moment to see it clearly. He walked away. He left a picture of Morty on the board. The gesture was tiny, and the gesture was everything the show could offer. A man choosing the imperfect actual life he had over the perfect simulated version of the life he had lost. Not because he was healed, but because he was tired of the devices, or at least tired enough on that particular afternoon to do something other than build another one. That is the show's thesis on every death in this record, offered not as a conclusion, but as a direction. The deaths cannot be undone. The Omega device erased Diane from every reality, and there is no portal to a dimension where that weapon does not exist. Bird Person came back as Phoenix Person, and then became Bird Person again, but the wedding still happened, and the toast still stood at the end of a life, and Tammy's gun still fired before the cake was cut. The original Rick and Morty are still in the ground in the backyard of a house that does not belong to the pair currently living above them. The Cronenberg world is still ruined. Fart is still dead. Roy Parsons is still on the floor of the carpet store. Campaign manager Morty is still in the airlock field with all the others. Rick J22 is still in the factory chamber. The deaths in this record are permanent in the way that the show insisted deaths should be permanent from episode 6 onward, and the permanence is not cruelty. It is the premise. Nothing the living carry can be put down by being clever about it, and no portal gun, however well engineered, opens a door to the place where the loss did not happen. What can be changed, and what the show argues is the only thing that can be changed, is the direction the mind is pointed in response to what cannot be changed. Rick has the most powerful mind ever depicted in this genre, and he pointed it for most of his existence at the manufacture of distance, the engineering of conditions under which the loss could not reach him cleanly, the construction of a universe small enough that nothing surprising could arrive from outside it. The show spent 8 seasons documenting what that project produced, which was the Citadel, and the portal gun, and the central finite curve, and the hologram in the frozen dimension, and the hunt, and the garage on the specific night. And it spent 8 seasons asking the same question underneath every demonstration, which was not whether the project was impressive, because it was undeniably and spectacularly impressive, but whether impressive was the same as good, and whether good was the same as enough, and whether enough was a category that applied to a life organized entirely around
around, never being reached. The answer the show returns, offered in the specific language of a series that was too honest to offer it as a cure, is that the project was not enough and was never going to be enough. And that the moments when Rick was closest to something that might be called a life worth living were the moments when he set the project down. The toast at Bird Person's wedding, the surrender to the Federation on the family's behalf, the entry into Bird Person's damaged mind, the acceptance of Morty's hug in the hollow aftermath of Rick Prime's death, the decision not to jump into the fear hole. None of these were recoveries. None of them resolved the underlying grief or repaired the relationships the grief had bent out of shape or undid any of the deaths in this record. They were simply moments when the genius was not pointed at the avoidance, when the most powerful instrument available to this specific person was briefly aimed at presence rather than escape. And the show treated those moments with a tenderness it reserved for almost nothing else in its entire run, precisely because they were so rare and because the rarity was the diagnosis. Every painful death in Rick and Morty is, at the level the show was operating on when it built them, a death of a specific kind of possibility. Diane's death was the death of the possibility of a life pointed outward rather than inward. Bird Person's death was the death of the possibility of the last witness, the one person who remembered the man capable of meaning the toast. The deaths of the original Rick and Morty were the death of the possibility of a relationship with actual consequences, the kind of relationship you cannot portal out of because you built it in a universe you cannot afford to abandon. The deaths of self across the middle seasons were the deaths of versions of people who had not yet been fully shaped by proximity to the most sophisticated avoidance mechanism ever built. Rick Prime's death was the death of the possibility that completing the revenge mission would resolve the grief that commissioned it. What survives, in the record and in the show, is the same thing that survived in the garage on the specific night and in the fear hole on the alien planet, and in every moment the show caught Rick choosing the actual, imperfect present over the engineered simulation of something better. The attachment is what survives. The stubborn, irrational, philosophically indefensible attachment to specific people in a specific reality that the metamind has proven beyond argument is one of infinite, indistinguishable alternatives. Rick knows the multiverse is infinite. He knows that Morty exists in billions of copies across every reality inside and outside the curve. He knows that the specific Morty he has been traveling with since the pilot is not cosmically unique or irreplaceable in any sense the intelligence can defend. He put a photograph of that Morty on a board outside the fear hole and walked away from the only available version of his wife because the photograph felt more like a reason to keep going than the version of her the hole was offering. The show does not explain this. It does not give Rick a speech about why the irrational attachment matters more than the rational argument. It simply shows the gesture and trusts the audience to read what the gesture cost a man for whom every gesture is usually engineered, for whom spontaneous and undefended expressions of care are the rarest and most expensive things in the inventory. The photograph was the most honest thing he did in the entire 7th season, and the honesty was in its smallness, its refusal to be anything more than a small, true thing in the aftermath of the largest and most defining death the series had staged. The deaths in this record are what they are. The boy is still in the backyard. The wedding is still over. The garage still has a workbench in it, and a stool, and the specific low light of late evenings spent building things rather than feeling them. None of that changes. The show was never interested in changing it. What it was interested in, across 8 seasons and 26 deaths per episode, and the handful of deaths that were built to actually land, was the question of what a person does with the weight of what cannot be changed, whether they build more devices or whether they occasionally, imperfectly, put the devices down and stay. Rick put a photograph of Morty on a board outside a fear hole in a Denny's bathroom on an alien planet. It is not a recovery. It is not a cure. It is a man with the most powerful mind ever depicted, making the smallest possible choice in the direction of the actual life over the engineered one. And the show treated it with more care than it treated the death of the most important villain in its history, because the show understood which of those two events was the harder one. Every painful death in Rick and Morty was building to that photograph. Every loss in this record was the price of arriving at the moment when a man who could build anything chose, briefly and without ceremony, not to build his way out of something. The deaths were the argument. The photograph was the answer. And the answer, offered quietly outside a bathroom in a Denny's,
was that the specific and unrepeatable and philosophically indefensible person standing in front of you is worth more than the infinite alternatives the multiverse is holding in reserve, and that knowing this is not intelligence, and that acting on it is not genius, and that neither of those facts makes it any less true.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.